Each presentation will be 13 minutes long with 7 minutes for questions. So each presentation will be 20 minutes in total. Okay.
I don't think the people online are.
Yeah, no, it was fixed. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
We
Okay.
fixed it, but. Okay.
So just click please mute your microphone and any questions can be entered in your comments, in the comment section, and we will monitor the comment section. And for all the speakers, I will give you a 2-minute warning. So 11 minutes into your talk, I'll give you a sign saying 2 minutes. So that's a 2-minute warning. And I'll probably give you extra 15 to 30 seconds after your allotted time, but please try to wrap up.
Yes. It's because you're in the Zoom, not the PowerPoint one. Oh, so if you go to the PowerPoint window. Thank you, Abby. Yeah. Thank you, PhD. Thank you. Anyone under 30. Can you see?
Don't laugh when they
No.
will be older
No.
than 30.
Okay. Display. You don't need any notes? No. Okay. No, not the Dell laptop.
Aha.
It's not.
Well, yeah, this is the most complicated part of the whole day.
No, that's not what I want to do. How do I get to Chrome again? Oh, figured it out.
Thinking about it. Yeah. Success. Got there, Abby.
I just want to do this. Oh, it's not.
That's going to stay there, I think.
Yeah, it's because we're in Zoom app, not Chrome.
You're good. Okay.
Great. So we'll have our first speaker, Emma Sampson, and she'll be talking about the global goals and local values applying an interest convergence lens to Panama's marine conservation commitments.
So I won't repeat my title, we'll just get into the presentation. So the conversation surrounding conservation is one that is based on values, personal opinions, and social constructs of how we as a society choose to define what nature is. It is also a conversation that has profound disagreements because most definitions are subjective and are reflecting a personal point of view. When thinking about conservation in this way, a way that is rooted in cultural identity and livelihood rather than just a scientific thing we are trying to protect, the role of interest, power, and perceptions come into play, and it adds much weight to answering the question, how should we protect it? So interest convergence is the principle that suggests social change for minority groups occurs primarily when their interests align with those of the majority. The concept developed by the late Derek Bell explains that civil rights victories for Black people were only achieved when they converged with the interests of whites. Bell's theory of interest convergence was significantly shaped by the landmark 1954 Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education, which ordered the end of state-mandated racial segregation in public schools. Bell asserted that this decision cannot be understood without considering that a nation cannot maintain its economic, political, and social superiority over the rest of the world while remaining silent about anti-Black racism in America. Interest convergence theory serves as a powerful tool for understanding the interplay of power and subordination in social justice movements. Bell's notion of interest convergence argues that policies did not spring from the goodness of people's hearts, but were rather a face-saving political necessity. Despite claims of harmony, certain voices tend to dominate such networks and questions the entanglements of power present within every movement. So within the international community, Panama has been seen as an international blue leader for environmental conservation. By 2021, Panama announced that they had created the Coiba National Marine Park, And through this marine park in 2023, they announced that they have met their goal to 30 by 30 by conserving 54% of their national waters. Panama has primarily done this through another 48 marine protected areas ranging in levels of restrictions. And in Bocas del Toro, where I completed my fieldwork, is home to Panama's first national marine park, Bastionmentos Island. Most recently, Panama has also signed rights of nature into law, stipulating that the state and all citizens recognize nature's intrinsic value. There's also many local marine conservation efforts in Bocas del Toro. So the first one is ecotourism, and while this is not necessarily a local conservation effort because it's run by the government, it does contribute significantly to the economy through within 95%. But this comes into the local marine conservation efforts because a lot of locals have taken into consideration conservation initiatives that they can do to educate locals while they're working in the ecotourism industry. For example, I had one local tell me that they didn't know they were fishing in the National Marine Park, but after getting involved in tourism and participating in the conservation certifications for boat drivers, they try to be more careful regarding where they are fishing and driving. The second one is restoration initiatives, and there are so many different restoration initiatives within the region. So from preserving reefs, mangroves, and rainforests, you can see examples such as Up in the Hill, which is a permaculture farm, and Mother of Corals, which is a reef restoration project, among so many others. There's also a lot of education and volunteering within the region. Bocas del Toro is a small and very connected place. It's very much a place where everyone knows everyone, and they come together when something needs to be done. An example of this could be looking at the Carnera Island beach cleanup, which is a local conservation effort where they clean up the beaches of Island Carnera. So after understanding Panama's national policy objectives and the multiple ways that local community get involved within conservation, it made me ask, does Panama's conservation agenda align with local conservation perspectives in Bocas del Toro? And spoiler alert, but after many interviews, I found that things do not align. The government puts out these broad sweeping conservation initiatives that locals do not feel reflected or valued in. And local conservation initiatives feel underwhelmingly unsupported by the government. So even though there is this shared common goal between the government and the community in the effort to conserve the environment, they do not work together, creating a disconnect. So what I did, I traveled to Bocas del Toro in April to May earlier this year, and I conducted a qualitative study using semi-structured interviews. I conducted these interviews across 3 of the main islands and interviewed 33 participants. In my interviews, I had a few questions regarding their relationship with the ocean, the effectiveness of conservation, as well as local conservation and government conservation efforts in the region. And then I allowed participants to speak openly and freely about whatever conservation initiatives they wanted to talk to me about. Throughout my analysis, I then divided these participants into 2 groups, locals and expats. And this classification helped by analysis because locals tended to have a response to conservation that was rooted in culture and livelihood, where expats typically had more of a recreational connection to the environment. So in my interviews, I found that there was significant frustration among community members within conservation efforts, and this was leading to the disconnect. So when I asked community members about the National Marine Park or Panama's commitment to protecting 54%, many residents had the same response. Yeah, I know about it, but it's nothing, or simply saying it's rubbish. When asking about community projects, one local said, it sometimes feels like a losing battle in Bocas, and another local expressing frustration saying, this country is not at the forefront of making climate change, and yet they were the first ones to find the loophole. This was a very interesting quote to me as the participant was expressing that these catchy slogan conservation initiatives is a competitive field for governments, but there is no actual backing financially to manage it. It creates a disillusionment for locals because even though there's these policies in place for conservation, the on-the-ground realities seem to be very different for locals. And this is something that's so important to their livelihood and culture, but it's also implemented by people who are not a part of their community. And this approach to conservation has led to a gap between policy and practice, where marine conservation efforts are implemented on paper without any tangible impact or local buy-in. And this leads to conflict between the government and the community members. So this then led me to my second question that arose from the finding of this disconnect. And this was the question of whose voice matters or whose voice is valued within conservation. And in understanding conservation in Panama, it's very important to recognize the socio-historical context of the region. Panama was dominated by U.S. capitalist pursuits in 1903 and has since maintained a relationship of economic dependency with the U.S. This can be seen through development projects such as the Panama Canal and the US Panamanian link with the United Fruit Company. And it's also important to consider that Bocas del Toro is a small rural archipelago that's outside of the mainland of Panama. And so since the 1990s, Bocas has moved away from a plantation economy and has focused more on tourism. And these colonial legacies have often influenced conservation, where these embedded racial hierarchies affect policy and decision making. So in my research, I divided these power dynamics into two categories: intergovernmental, meaning between community members and the government, and intercommunity, between the government and the community members. And so to start with intergovernmental, the colonial legacy of conservation has traditionally relied on framing local communities as lacking the capacity or knowledge for effective environmental stewardship. And this justified the imposition of external groups and policies to show locals how to do conservation. As such, these colonial framings often ignore the complex cultural, historical, and social dimensions that define locals' communities' relationship with their environment and sidelines local voices in conservation. So for example, I had one local tell me, when I go to the government to talk about conservation, it is like talking to a sock with a hole in the bottom. They just don't listen. Or another local saying, when they put in the laws, conservation means nothing because the community is going one way and the government is going another. The power that the government holds typically allows their interests of conservation to overshadow those in the local community. This power can be summed up into one quote: what they call progress, I call destruction. So then we can move on to talking about the intercommunity power dynamics. And this is particularly prevalent to the lens of interest convergence, because one critique of the theory is that its tendency to assume a unified interest among groups, oversimplifying the diverse and often conflicting goals of individuals within those groups. So while the focus of this project was on the government-local dynamics, intercommunity power imbalances such as those between locals and expats is also important to recognize. So as highlighted by earlier work, this is particularly prevalent within Bocas del Toro because since the 2000s, they have had a huge influx of lifestyle migrants come into the region from around the world due to a lower cost of living and a perceived higher quality of life. These power disparities that exist between locals and expats exacerbate the conservation challenges because Western expats often have greater financial resources, time, and networks where they can benefit more, while locals lacking similar resources face constraints in conservation participation. So these intercommunity power dynamics were expressed by participants in many ways. The first one being the imposition of external knowledge. As one participant said, the problem is that we see so many people come and they tell us, and after they leave, we do not see them again. Another way that these power dynamics is the issue of cultural imposition. As one local expressed, well, why are you telling me what to do in my country? And lastly, there's a perceived issue of wealth disparity, as one local expresses this by saying that the government doesn't just let them build anything, or just lets them build anything, and if the local Boca government doesn't allow it, Panama City or the federal government would override this. So these power dynamics, whether between the government or within the community, adds complexity to the marine conservation movement in Bocas del Toro because it determines whose voice is valued and whose interests are reflected within conservation initiatives. So overall, my research in Bocas del Toro reveals that there's a convergence of interests within the community where members inherently desire to protect nature. However, the divergence of interest becomes apparent between community values and government actions. So federal policies like the Master-Mendes Island National Marine Park and the 30 by 30 initiative are formally established, but those I interviewed in Bocas expressed significant concerns that these policies lack any tangible impact. Conservation initiatives appear on paper to be progressive strides towards environmental conservation, but are frequently perceived as mere blue washings, reflecting international rather than community priorities. Without the action on the ground, it seems that the values of the government go as far as symbolic conservation for international recognition rather than substantive action. So I think we can all agree that conservation initiatives aren't going anywhere. And if anything, they're only going to get more prominent as we move forward in a world where climate change is becoming more prevalent or is becoming a bigger issue. So when we talk about conservation or think about implementing conservation, we need to understand the local context and understand the impact it will have on local communities. We also need to raise the voices of local communities because if we do not talk to them, we'll never know the local context or the historical power imbalances. So even though my research was focused on the small archipelago of Bocas del Toro, beyond my work, this is a conversation that can contribute to international conservation. The issues of power and external impositions is something that exists all around the world. For example, the Chagos Archipelago and the Easter Island MPA have been widely criticized due to the marginalization of local populations and a lack of consultation. And there are other examples such as the Champaran Marine Protected Area, the Palau National Marine Sanctuary, and the Phoenix Island Protected Area. So the case study of Bocas del Toro is unique in its context, but it is not unique in the shared struggles of conservation. It's time to recognize, as one local so eloquently put it, it must be a balance of power between the government and the local. It's our responsibility. So lastly, I would like to thank Dr. Will Schwartz and Dr. Cinda Scott for supervising this project, and to Ocean Nexus for funding my research. Thank you to my friends and my family and my mom, who is here today, for always cheering me on and being my biggest cheerleader. Lastly, I would like to thank all whom I met in Bocas, for this research truly would not have been possible without their time and trust. Thank you.
So much. So we have some time for question, and we'll start with students. If any students have a question.
Hi, Emma. This person? No. It's still on. Let's hope the mic can pick it up. So for interest convergence, the theory that you kind of base a lot of this analysis in, it seems like a lot of that logic was drawn from a landmark American Supreme Court case. So what logic was used by either the author of those papers or your own research to apply that to international conservation frameworks or to sovereign jurisdictions like Canada?
Sure. So let me know if I didn't understand the question properly. But interest convergence is rooted in social justice movements, and particularly the civil rights movement in the United States. And even though it is rooted in that context, and my paper doesn't necessarily go into the depth of the different racial dynamics that do exist in Panama, the overall theory of, you have to have one group's interest and a minority group's interest and a majority group's interest, and then those things need to come together until actual change can happen. That part of the theory still would apply to. That's the part of the theory that I did apply to the international conservation framework. It hasn't. There's no actual direct connect. That's there's no actual direct connection that was really pulled, but yeah, it was the overarching general theory that we used to.
We'll go to Abby, but because the microphone isn't working, Emma, if you can repeat the question from the audience. Yeah.
Hi, Emma. Great presentation. Really proud of you in the direction you took this. Well done. You talked a bit about sort of the distance between governments and communities. I'm wondering what you learned about the role that the physical distance between governments and communities plays, because
Yeah.
I've been to Bocas, so this is common knowledge for me, but Bocas is very far from Panama City, so I'm wondering what role that played particularly, and if you think that having some sort of government branch physically in Bocas would change anything, or is that just sort of a band-aid solution per se?
Definitely. So for anyone online, Abby's just asking about the physical distance between Panama City and Bocas del Toro, where most of the conservation initiatives are being made. So yes, there is a massive physical distance between Panama City, where these conservation policies are being implemented, and Bocas del Toro, and those two things generally don't talk. And there's also the local Bocas government in but even then, when I didn't get to talk to anybody in government, which was kind of a limitation of my study, just because the election was going on while I was in Bocas. So before the election, for 3 weeks prior, everyone was like, not my problem. And then after the election, it was just so busy, getting everything turned over for the new government. So unfortunately, I didn't get to talk to anyone. But yeah, the physical distance is hard, especially when the local Bocas government doesn't necessarily talk to the people in the federal government. And they're also really far away, so the travel and the commute is hard. And I did allude to it a little bit in my presentation, talking about in the intergovernmental power dynamics that that they're these policies are implemented by people who are not a part of their community. And that's one of probably the greatest struggles with conservation issues that we just they just don't understand. But I would it's hard to suggest what government should do in a community that I'm also not a part of. But I mean, I definitely think it would be beneficial to have some sort of thing in place, whether that's more local hands on the ground, or if there's a person that can travel between Bocas and the federal government to communicate what's happening. Maybe that's the way to do it. I haven't really thought about it.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's also really lovely to see some of the images from where you were during your field work. So I have a question that follows up a bit, I think, from maybe the theme of the first question. You talked in your presentation about the history of Panama, and in particular, kind of American imperialism and exploitation of the nation in the early 20th century. I was intrigued by some of your comments about the expat community that today kind of reenacts some of those same injustices, particularly from the perspective of research traditions, where often researchers have also enacted some of those traditions of exploitation by coming in, doing work, leaving. And I know you've thought a little bit about this, so I wonder if you could share your reflections and how that experience was for you, but also how you thought about trying to hopefully not reenact some of those things through your own work.
Yeah. So yeah, that was a huge thing I thought about, because I also come from a background, I did my undergrad in international development studies, and we very much in depth talk about the imposition of researchers going into a community that they're not a part of and asking all these questions and basically begging for their traditional knowledge to then tell someone who's not from their community. And Will and I had many conversations about this, I think, before I left. Getting to Panama, I did have Cinda, who has been a part of the community of Bocas for I think 10 years now. She's been there more than that. So she's shaking her head. More than that. And she's very known within the community. And Cinda is also an expat. She comes from the United States. But because she's lived there so long, she has really great connections with a lot of the people in the community. So that was kind of my first step into the door to try to meet some people and make some connections. And then the other way that I went about it is that I did have the translator that I used for some of my local interviews. She is very, very well known. The community has grown up in Bocas for her entire life. And before we actually went into any of the smaller communities to actually do interviews, her and I sat down and spent probably 2 hours over coffee, just talking about, what it's like in the communities. And she told me a lot about the history of the communities and, what it means when expats come into the communities and things like that. So that was another way around it. And I mean, as much as I can't do anything but the fact that I'm there researching, and it was a very valuable experience to me. So I did try to express that as much to the community as possible and try to learn as much from other people who were willing to share that knowledge as well. So I guess that's kind of how I got around it.
Thanks so much. Round of applause.
Yeah.
Look at my supervisor.
Let's take it. It's away from the face. Perfect. Okay.
What's the how do you pronounce the first word?
I don't. It's okay.
Is this the right one, Bethany? I just want to make sure. Okay. You think it's okay? Giant metal.
Sorry, so we will move on to our second presentation by Bethany Paul. The presentation is titled Wichi Kemine, Revive the Bay.
Nailed it, Will.
So yes, hello everyone. It's really nice to see you all. This presentation is about Waju Kamine, Help Us Revive the Bay, water back in the Kwadi region. And it's about Basco de Magadi lessons from 14,000 years of honoring Samagwan, which is water. So Wabanaki means the people of the dawn. They've lived and cared for this region where we are now over 14,000 years. One of the nations within the Wabanaki Confederacy are the Basco de Magadi peoples, and this is their home territory here in Orange. So it's in present day here's this southern New Brunswick and northern Maine. Gotta practice my, I don't know if that's gonna work. And within the heart of the Basco de Magadi homelands is the Scoodic River, or the St. Croix River as it's also known. And this river has faced many issues such as pollution and exacerbated harms from colonization. And it's also been used to separate the Basco de Magadi with the Canadian and US border. So I'm a treaty person. I'm an 11th generation settler to the Wolastoqey and Basco de Magadi homelands. And I worked over the past decade in this region with an interest in making space for the Basco de Magadi to reassert Indigenous governance as the original and best caretakers of this land. So in a decade where both marine conservation and supporting Indigenous self-governance are of utmost importance, this research looks to answer 3 questions. How can we best support Basco de Magadi-led marine conservation? What does the Bay need to become healthy again? And what would a successful collaborative process look like to protect the Kwadi region? This research was guided by the Waterback framework, which was coined by Dr. Kelsey Leonard and 16 other Indigenous scholars. And they talk about water having memory. So today, Water Samagwan is with us from Chibuktuk. Maybe Abby can do some water testing on it later. And they discuss overlap of Indigenous worldviews where water and the views of water are from the Wabanaki people is that it's not just a resource, but a relative. So asking the question, what does water need? There are 6 themes within the Waterback framework, including the fundamental view that water rights come with responsibilities. Indigenous peoples believe that with a right to access clean water comes a responsibility to look after that water. So due to colonization and systems of oppression, decisions have been made for so long about traditional territorial waters that exclude Indigenous peoples, leading to extreme ecological, cultural, and spiritual harms. So first, a bit of background. The peace and friendship treaties were agreed in both oral and written traditions between the British Crown and the Wabanaki nations. The English word treaty comes from Latin tractatus, which means bargaining and managing. In contrast, the Basco de Magadi word lakutuwakan has a very different meaning. It means to make family. Treaties promise peaceful coexistence and to protect the Wabanaki rights to fish and hunt forever. So for the Wabanaki people, this meant that there would always be fish. So it was not about a land surrender. The lands and waters never belonged to the British Crown, and Canada has assumed management over the Wabanaki territory without a proper agreement from the First Nations on this land. Next, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So this was signed by Canada in 2021, and we also have a legally binding federal act. So 3 articles are really important for this research: the right to spiritual relationship with traditional territories and the waters and coastal seas, and to uphold their responsibilities to future generations, the right of Indigenous peoples to conserve and protect the environment and to productive capacity of their lands, resources, and territories, and that no storage or disposal of hazardous materials happen on Indigenous peoples' territory without their free, prior, and informed consent. The Kwadi region was described as a Garden of Eden, pre-colonization, as it is rich in nutrient upwellings and supports a range of biodiversity all around these islands. Yet the Bay of Fundy has actually no formal protection other than a 7 square kilometer area, which is in yellow on the map. This is musquash. It's beautiful. It's small. There's urgency in protecting this area because it's a hot spot for marine based industries due to its high productivity. So with the treaties and the declaration in mind, this is an incredible opportunity to advance Indigenous-led marine conservation. So there are many conservation tools. This is a very small snapshot of them that can protect Indigenous, or that can protect areas like ocean and coastal zones. So within Canada, there's a term called Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas. This is not Canadian or grounded within Canadian legislation. It's grounded in Indigenous laws. However, some First Nations have paired this tool with other colonial tools. So I'll talk about those now. So National Marine Conservation Areas, both of those tools can protect land, beach, and ocean zones. And Parks Canada operates the NMCAs. Marine National Wildlife Areas, that's a tool with Canadian Wildlife Service, so Environment Canada, and they can protect beach zones, so intertidal zone and ocean space. Marine Protected Areas, that's through the Oceans Act with Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and that can protect ocean space. And then within New Brunswick, there's a particular act called the Protected Natural Areas Act that can protect crown land or land that the province currently has jurisdiction over and beach space. Oh, sorry, I forgot to say that these tools are the ones that I mentioned at the end are colonial tools. So it's really important to keep in mind that with any colonially led conservation tool, the management power is not balanced. So the federal minister actually has final say in it. So this is not true co-governance. So the tools must be used with care and with some of the results that I'll talk about in mind. So for my methods, what did we do for the research? There was a narrative literature review I did with looking at conservation legislation, like we talked about just now, and looking at different case studies among First Nations who are working on Indigenous protected areas. Once I got to the area, relationship building was central to the research. This started years ago in my work in the region and getting to know and love the people in this place. So this spring I participated in celebrations of the restoration work that's been happening along the Scoodic River to get to know more people. And through my internship with the Passamaquoddy Recognition Group, my coworkers and I conducted a talking circle style interview in Zabayak, one of the Besquidamugati communities, where we talked to elders and members of the environmental department. We also interviewed and met with researchers, government, and non-governmental staff to find out what concerns people have about the Bay, what they'd like to see protected, and in what way. Next, I used in vivo software to analyze the meeting transcripts. I highlighted key themes, overarching themes, and through inductive analysis. So 4 overarching themes I'll talk about today from the results are abundance to scarcity, concerns for the Bay, holistic management, and localization. So this was a common theme throughout the research, throughout the results, and is woven into all of the other themes as well. This idea that there's a lot of mixed emotions. So a lot of the elders I talked to were feeling very blessed that they're able to experience hunting porpoise when they were younger with elders, but now you can't even hunt porpoise. If you find one on the side of the beach, it's considered hazardous waste because of PCBs. Another big concern is the lack of understanding historic abundance. So among scientists and decision makers, this is a concept called shifting baseline syndrome. It was coined by Daniel Pauly, where as one interviewee describes, The shifting baseline syndrome is looking out at the bay and thinking everything is beautiful, beautiful fish, all the resources are great. But it's not, it's the new normal. So this generational amnesia doesn't actually happen in Indigenous oral history traditions because there's collective memory of that abundance. A concern for many researchers and the Basco-Mugati tribal members I talked to is that management of harvesting is happening in silos. There's a lack of research funding for things like harvesting of sea cucumbers, green sea urchins, and seaweed, which is perceived by interviewees to be both under-researched and under-monitored. There's a deep concern for overexploitation of all these species. And because there's so much interconnectedness of life, which is a critical viewpoint in the Basco-Mugati worldview, we must avoid centering monetary gains, but see all species as relatives. Next, this relates to the next theme, which is localization. So localizing economics and decision-making to improve ecological and community well-being. As one interviewee said, if we got back to supporting the local area, that's where we couldn't possibly have hurt these populations. There wouldn't be poverty or homelessness. So the solution has always been there, and at one time we lived it. Another researcher was talking about the idea of aquaculture being to support the local community, but then it snowballed and became a global economy. And so looking at not wanting to deprive an area of something that's economically valuable, but that there's a way of balancing it to protect marine life. So in terms of recommendations from the research to help answer our 3 questions, the first was, how can we best support Basco-Mugati-led marine conservation? So for ongoing meetings that are happening now with Fisheries and Oceans Canada on their marine planning process, we can ensure co-governance is happening through the treaty principles, that these are upheld, the rights of and sovereignty of the Basco-Mugati in decision-making about water are respected. So we can't be putting industry needs over the health of the environment or the rights of Indigenous peoples and future generations any longer. For the Basco-Mugati, one of the recommendations from the meetings we had were that the Wabanaki nations all need to come together and discuss cross-border Quadi region IPCA that could use tools such as the National Marine Conservation Tool, or National Marine Conservation Area Tool, which could protect an interconnected area of land and sea. The second question was, what does the bay need to become healthy? So beyond place-based conservation, such as marine protected areas, policy changes are needed to meet the Basco-Mugati vision. This involves power sharing, caring for the bay, defending it from harms, looking at the industries of fisheries, aquaculture, and rockweed, and localizing those decisions. As the UN declaration states, the deleterious substances must be approved by the nation within where those substances are going to be used. This did not happen with the aquaculture pesticides. Co-governance of harvesting decisions, such as there were a lot of concerns about gear types being used that negatively harm the benthic environments, including through sedimentation, bycatch of species, and entanglement. The third question we had was, what does a collaborative process look like to protect and revitalize the bay? So this needs a value shift. We need to think about power sharing. So as Canadians, we all benefit from the peace and friendship treaties, but can we honestly say that we have upheld our treaty obligations? So we need to be thinking about new values for managing actions in the bay. This includes honoring treaties, ensuring healthy and abundant sustenance is available for all for future generations forever. This involves centering the health of the bay and upholding Indigenous knowledge systems in all of our decision-making. We need to be thinking about what does Samagwan need? these are my references, and I'd like to give a big chiwaliwan to everyone who shared their information and knowledge and stories to Samagwan, Ziganamek, and Beskorum. Sorry, I'm a little sleep deprived. To Chief Hugh and Max and Lucia, hello. To all my coworkers and friends. I didn't expect to do that. Sorry.
You got all three of them.
And,
You got all three of them.
And thanks to my tax for the funding and the Past Quality Recognition Group for the amazing internship. My family and to Michael and to Chewy, the service dog.
The goodest boy.
All right, then we'll have some time for a few questions or comments. Yes.
It's not working. Amazing presentation, Stephanie. Always a
Thank
pleasure
you.
hearing you talk. My question, so with Beskorum kind of crossing international borders, how does that impact whatever kind of conservation measures that they're?
Yeah, thanks,
And,
Scott.
please repeat the question.
Yeah, sure. So Scott's asking about conservation measures. How can they be impacted with the fact that the Beskorum homelands are both in the United States currently and colonial Canada? So that's a great question. There are some examples of cross-border conservation in the US and Mexico. Actually, one of the National Estuarine Research Reserves is along the border there. So something like that might be possible. Definitely it's possible to use an IPCA as a tool because this area is all, the homeland is all Beskorum territory. So it has to be Beskorum led is really the main thing, but it could use colonial tools as well. Ireland?
Yeah, thanks so much for the presentation, Bethany, and I just love your passion whenever you talk about this project. And I really like what you said about the value shift that needs to happen, and I'm just kind of wondering what you think that looks like on the like federal scale with the like DFO and that kind of government level.
I think, oh, sorry, Ireland asked about what a value shift could look like on a federal level, like thinking of DFO. So getting to know the people of this land is the best way to building relationship is essential to truly understanding what it means to be a treaty person and making sure that the power is shared. Yeah, there's a lot to be learned from the people who've looked after this land for forever. So yeah.
We have one question online,
yeah,
and I
sure.
think we'll wrap up with that.
Yeah.
The question is, what was the most impactful part of your project?
Ooh, that's a great question. They're asking online what was the most impactful part of the project. I'll go back to this picture because it's so cute. It's kind of small, but I got to participate in an amazing celebration of the restoration of the Scoodic River. We did a relay race along the river and these are some of the children that were involved. There are people from age 7 to up to 83, and yeah, it was just such a lovely way to celebrate the Ziganamek coming home after some of the dams have been removed in this area. So yeah, it was very special.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I know,
Yeah,
just
we'll-
at the break.
I mean, there's only two presentations before break, two presentations.
I think that that's usually reception today, so yeah.
Okay, well, up next we have Otis Itai. He will be presenting on a presentation titled Uncovering Synergies, Piloting Network Analysis Approach to Understanding the Collaboration Efforts for NARW Conservation. Thank you.
Thank you, Will, for introducing me and for introducing my title. Just so it'll sink in, I'll just repeat it again. My name is Ojas Gitai, and I'll be talking about piloting a network analysis approach to understand the collaboration efforts for North Atlantic right whale conservation. As we all know, the North Atlantic right whale faces numerous threats to its survival, including entanglement in fishing gear, vessel strike, habitat degradation, and declining reproductive success. Effective conservation strategies, including integration of extensive genomic study, requires collaboration among various stakeholders. My graduate project, which is also an activity 4.1 of Genome Canada Right Whale project, is a research that intended to map the collaboration networks within the North Atlantic right whale conservation community by using sophisticated network analysis techniques to enhance the collaboration conservation efforts. To address the critical challenge of fragmented collaboration in North Atlantic right whale conservation, my research focuses on two key questions. The first one explores the potential of tools like social network analysis to uncover patterns of collaboration, identify key influencers or hidden entities, and highlights gaps in the stakeholder and engagement, ultimately strengthening conservation strategies. The second one examines how stakeholders are connected, how information flows through the network, and how collaborative efforts can optimize to create a unified approach to addressing critical threats. Social network analysis is a primary technique for creating collaborative network matrix, which includes names, affiliations, years of collaboration among individuals and organizations active in North Atlantic right whale conservation efforts. This methodology enabled an exploration of social, cultural, and political factors. These factors influence the development, distribution, and utilization of scientific knowledge within the conservation community. In conservation endeavors, social network analysis presents manifold advantages. Firstly, it identifies pivotal stakeholders and influential figures essential for informed decision-making. Secondly, through the delineation of collaboration patterns and detection of gaps, SNA enriches strategic planning, resource allocation, and policy formulation. Additionally, it facilitates seamless communication and information exchange among diverse stakeholders, nurturing synergy and collective action. By spotlighting discrepancies between current and key players, SNA underscores missed opportunities for more effective conservation diffusion. In my research methodology, I first identified key stakeholders and right holders within the North Atlantic right whale conservation community by gathering data from the North Atlantic right whale consortiums held from 2021 to 2023. Then I used Cytoscape software to visualize the data and create a social network map. This data was entered as an edge list representing connections between each stakeholders. Finally, I conducted statistical analysis using network centralities. In analyzing social networks, I used several key parameters to understand stakeholder roles and influence. Each circle represents a node, an entity, and each line represents an edge, a connection within the network. Network centrality is a critical component comprising four main types. Degree centrality measures the number of direct connection a stakeholder has. Betweenness centrality identifies stakeholders that serve as bridges within the network. Closeness centrality highlights those who can quickly reach others across the network. Eigenvector centrality assesses influence by ranking nodes based on the importance of their connections. Additionally, the clustering coefficient examines how interconnected a stakeholder's neighbors are, reflecting the level of community or subgroup formation. Together, these matrices offer a detailed understanding of influence and collaboration dynamics within the network. Let's talk about some results, shall we? On the right side of the screen, you'll see a snapshot of a larger matrix developed from my pilot data. This matrix was instrumental in mapping out connections and patterns within the network. Through the sociogram analysis, we uncovered valuable insights, including the structure and dynamics of the conservation network, key stakeholder driving North Atlantic right whale conservation efforts, collaborative pattern between stakeholders and rights holders, and potential areas of conflict among key players. While collecting data, we noticed attendance patterns at the consortium that didn't seem significant at first, but through SNA lens, they revealed valuable insights. The consortium maintains a core group of repeat attendees, providing continuity and fostering long-term collaboration. However, a noticeable number of participants only attend once or twice, highlighting inconsistencies in engagement. This could be due to the personal priorities, shifting research focuses, or even logistical challenges. Understanding these patterns is crucial for retaining interest, broadening participation, and ensuring that conservation efforts reflect diverse perspectives and priorities. This bar graph illustrates the affiliations of stakeholders and rights holders, categorized into 8 groups based on their nature of work, as described in their mission statement, visions, and other provider details. The data reveals noticeable discrepancies in attendance across these groups. Government agencies exhibit consistent participation, likely due to their stable resources and organizational mandates, prioritizing North Atlantic right whale conservation. Conversely, attendance from NGOs and independent organizations is more variable, potentially reflecting resource constraints or shifting priorities that limit their consistent engagement. Indigenous participation, however, appears relatively low. This could partially due to individuals with unspecified affiliations being placed into others category, making it difficult to accurately access their roles and contributions. The analysis of stakeholders' power and influence within the North Atlantic right whale conservation network was based on key criteria like resources, authority, expertise, and access to information. We used average degree centrality values to assess the level of networking. To evaluate relative influence, we looked at eigenvector centrality values. A stakeholder analysis scale was created to identify the power and influence of each stakeholder category. The results were then plotted on a power influence grid template, as you can see on the right. This categorization highlights the importance of addressing power gaps and increasing inclusivity, especially for groups like indigenous communities and conservationists, to ensure a more balanced and effective conservation strategy in the North Atlantic right whale conservation community. However, these dynamics are not static. As more data is collected and analyzed, the positions of stakeholders may shift, revealing new patterns of collaboration and influence. This is an example of a subnetwork created by applying a filter on degree centrality values. It is particularly useful for identifying stakeholders who are less connected, highlighting those who may be key players but not necessarily central to the flow of information, collaboration, or decision-making within the North Atlantic right whale conservation network. This figure illustrates the connectivity of stakeholders within the network and distribution of their relationships. The first section, covering degrees 6 to 1 with an edge count of up to 100, represents participants who are moderately connected. These stakeholders are engaged but may not play a central role in decision-making. In contrast, the second section with a degree 2 and an edge count of 300 shows a dense concentration of connections per entity with few direct links. This indicates that while these stakeholders have limited direct engagement, their connections are highly significant, often involving key players or critical conduits of information. This research tackled fragmented collaboration among stakeholders in conversing the critically endangered North Atlantic right whales. Using social network analysis, it mapped stakeholder dynamics, identifying government agencies as key actors, but highlighting underrepresentation of indigenous groups and independent conservationists. The study exposed gaps in cross-sector collaboration and inconsistent participation from industries like fisheries and shipping, while it demonstrated the value of SNA in understanding power dynamics and engagement. Limitations such as reliance on public data call for more qualitative research like interviews and surveys, and advanced methods such as artificial intelligence. By focusing on marginalized groups and key industries, this work offers actionable strategies to strengthen participation, reduce human-wildlife conflicts, and promote inclusive conservation effort. It provides a foundation for building coalition, foster collaboration, and ensure diverse perspective to drive effective North Atlantic right whale conservation. It's only fair to acknowledge the incredible people who made this project possible in the first place. First, my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Megan Bailey for giving me the opportunity to work on such an impactful issue within the Genome Canada Right Whale project. I'm profoundly grateful to Dr. Hannah Harrison for your unwavering trust, guidance, and support throughout this academic journey. To Dr. Sean Brilliant, thank you for helping me navigate challenges of this project for complex data analysis and in the moments of self-doubt. A special thanks to Alexandra Cole for her expertise and thoughtful feedback as my second reader. And finally, to my parents, my sister, and my MMM family, including faculty. Thank you for being my cheerleaders, my confidence, and my safety net. This would not have been possible without your support. Thank you, everyone.
Questions, the microphone isn't working, so please just ask your question, or just if you can just repeat the question, that'd be great. Any question? Megan?
Perfect, thanks. Thank you so much, Urdas. And thanks for taking this on. I have a question about, you were able to attend one of these consortium meetings this fall.
Right.
I'm just curious what you saw in the data. Did it also seem like what you experienced in the consortium in terms of who's there and who's influential? I'm just curious about that, like, you know, having dug into data, 2 years of data, 3 years of data, and then actually sitting in the consortium. Just curious about if those felt like similar things or different.
That's a very good question. Thank you, Dr. Bailey. She asked if I have attended one of these consortiums, and is it same as I collected the consortium's data? What are the similarities, and is it same? That's what she asked. So when I was there, I can say that it's exactly same as of my data, because I collected the data, which is just the presenters in the consortium. And I used the 2023 data, and I haven't analyzed the 2024 data, which I attended. I would say it's kind of similar. When I looked at the presenters list in 2024, there are still less number of indigenous people or affiliations, and there's still less number of shipping industries or fishing harvesters. But whoever attended in 2023, I haven't analyzed it yet, but whoever attended in 2023, I can say they were all present in 2024. So that could be a discrepancy, and that can be analyzed if we'll look into it. But otherwise, it's a best platform to look into. That's why I took consortium as the first choice. And there are other, besides consortium, I can look into stakeholder meetings. There are so many NOAA Corporation, they organize so many things. Then take reduction committee, I can look into all of those and combine all the data and make it a bigger, larger map, which will give more analysis.
Abby,
Thanks for your presentation, Otis. I gather from your presentation that you're really passionate about the social network analysis method. And I'm curious, because I imagine you did extensive reading on it, what the literature or what practice says the relationship between the degree or the amount of connections and immediately tying that to a level of influence. So how do you rationalize looking at your model and seeing a certain stakeholder group or individual has a lot of those edges? Does that automatically mean that they have a lot of influence in this process, or is there something we're missing there that is a little bit more contextual?
All right, thank you for that question, Abby. Abby asked if how does my network assess the influence, or is it just because of their centrality? To answer that, I would use my supplementary diagram.
Yeah.
So it's not that simple, and it's quite tricky. So the connection, the degree centrality wouldn't just tell us what the influence is about each stakeholders. I am not talking about single individual. We have organized each individual into these 8 categories based on this power influence scale I made. We have assessed the influence. To explain this, we had took into account 4 factors like authority, resources, expertise, and information, like access to information. There are other factors which could be taken into account, which are, I would say it's a limitation, but then it requires more qualitative research, which is not part of the research as of now. After that, I use the degree centrality. If you'll see the DC, average DC values, for which is also has a scale from 0 to 1. If we'll take the factors, or it could be 1 to 10 as well, but we took it in the like average DC. And we use the eigenvector centrality, which gives us another range of influence as per the matrix. After making it all, higher the DC, higher connectivity, and higher the eigenvector gives higher the influence. That's how we calculated which category has more power and which category has more influence, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's
It's quite
very
tricky.
helpful.
Thank you very much for your talk, Ojas. You identified 2 different groups that weren't showing up very prevalently in your data, Indigenous groups, and you shared a little bit of your analysis onto why you think that is. But you also mentioned the shipping industry more broadly. Before your life in the MMM, you had a lot of experience in the shipping industry. And I wonder if even just drawing from your own life experience, if you might have any thoughts as to why that group doesn't show up in your data set as frequently.
That's a very good question, Dr. Harrison. Thank you for that. Dr. Harrison asked, as my previous life, I was a sailor, and if I can relate with why this industry are not showing so much interest and participation. To answer that, I would say I didn't knew that North Atlantic right whales need conservation till I got into the program. So that was quite answerable. Being in that industry for 7 years, I didn't know that need of conservation. I've been to Canada before by sea, and I didn't know that they need a conservation. And it's like we used to watch whales, never thought that we're killing them while I was on board. Also, we used to follow the international regulations made by IMO, MARPOL, mostly about pollution, not ecological impacts in a larger way, not for mammals. And I haven't heard any rules or regulation when I was on board which are related to whales. Maybe just because I haven't been to Gulf of St. Lawrence. Is it just for that shipping lanes where there's a speed reduction regulation? So I would say the industry which is more private, and I was on oil tankers, they are more economically focused, and they don't really care unless it's been imposed from very higher authority. They would follow if a port state control would like I don't know if USCG impose it. Otherwise, in international waters, they really don't care, and nobody would know if it's been followed or not.
Thank you.
One last question?
Based on the great question by Dr. Pearson, it sounds like from your responses that maybe like a lack of education and enforcement. Like for the shipping industry, do you have any suggestions for how you personally think it should be like improved so more people in the shipping industry know about field runoff and stuff?
Yeah, thank you, Laura, for that follow-up question. Laura asked if how can it be improved? How can international shipping be educated about this issue? So I would say it can be improved by reaching out to or by involving IMO. Like most of that work is done by Dr. Brown, whom I was honored to meet. And that is the only way, because international shipping, the private industry, it's a dynamic industry and it's always evolving. There are more stakeholders, new stakeholders coming up. There's new technology which is coming up, which is more climate, which is more pollution focused, like pollution prevention focused. To improve this, everybody, all the rules which are generally for Canada, they must be passed through IMO as well, so that they can be followed internationally. Like IMO has to impose them so everybody could follow them. That is the only way, I guess.
Can I add a piece to that?
Sure.
Because IMO, which I'm quite familiar with, has a Marine Environmental Protection Committee. They're very aware of this problem.
Right.
It's just there aren't the mechanisms in place yet. I underline yet to address this, but they are aware of it. And there are several advisory groups, one of which is GSAM, which deals with marine environmental protection and conservation, is very aware of the problem. So I think the need is to connect studies like yours to IMO directly, and there are ways of doing that.
Right, I totally concur with that. And they do know about it, but what they have done is they haven't imposed it in general. They are just saying that it's been imposed by local government, local port state control. So it will be followed when the vessel is in that area. That's why they don't know it when they are in some other sea, some other region. So if they'll generalize it, then everybody would know.
That's what's needed.
Yeah. I concur with what you said.
Great, thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, Georgia. Right. On you, Wi-Fi.
Okay, yeah, I think most people might.
Very, very specific wise process I must follow.
I use the same thing. Watching the baby picture.
Oh, yeah. My dog.
Yeah.
Blame it on the dog.
Absolutely, it's not the
Yeah, you gotta do it.
We'll give it a few more minutes because 10 quarter past was your time, and I just want to make sure if anybody joining online, they get a chance. Yeah. Okay, then we'll make sure that. We will have a coffee break after this presentation, so please have a seat. Okay, so we have the final presenter from the first session of day 2. We have Georgia Cooney. She will be presenting her study titled Evaluating the Conservation Standards as a Conservation Planning Framework, a case study of the Inner Bay of Fundy Conservation Plan Process.
Thank you so much, Will. Yeah, a bit of a mouthful of a title. But yeah, my research studies applying the conservation standards to a case study and seeing the challenges and successes of this in action. So to start with a little bit of introduction and context, the conservation standards are a set of steps used in conservation planning. There are 5 of them you can see on the screen. There's assess, plan, implement, analyze, and adapt, and share. These steps were created by the Conservation Measures Partnership in 2004, and there have been 4 versions since, the most recent that was released in 2020. And these standards are really significant and important for conservation planning because they provide a framework for how to conserve. And their cyclical nature is intended for adaptive management and conservation planning. So you can see that these steps aren't presented in a line, but rather as a circle. So you can go back to steps after you learn things and try to improve going forward. And I'm going to refer to the conservation standards as CS for the rest of my presentation, just so nobody's confused. A little background on my study area, which is the Inner Bay of Fundy. So the Inner Bay of Fundy is on the ancestral territory of the Wabanaki Confederacy. And you can see on this map here, the Inner Bay of Fundy extends from the Digby Gut up to St. John and everything inwards, and that's shown by the dark blue line on the map. The Inner Bay of Fundy is a really unique environment. It has the highest tides in the world, up to 16 meters. It's also critical habitat for a lot of species at risk, including Atlantic salmon and migratory shorebirds. And some of the unique habitat features of the Inner Bay of Fundy are dikes, which is drained salt marshes for agriculture, salt marsh, and 48 different rivers that feed into the Inner Bay of Fundy. Within the Inner Bay of Fundy is the Minas Basin, which you can see on the map with the dot. And it is considered an ecologically and biologically significant area. Within the Inner Bay of Fundy, there are 2,300 species plus that can be found. So it's home to a lot of important species, including birds, mammals, and fish. And 2 main industries in the Inner Bay of Fundy are tourism and fishing, and another activity that occurs is tidal power development. And so a lot of research is going on in the area. So how do the conservation standards and the Inner Bay of Fundy connect? So this is through the Inner Bay of Fundy Conservation Plan process, which is led by Environment and Climate Change Canada's Canadian Wildlife Service and facilitated by Global Conservation Solutions. So this process has taken place through a series of online workshops, the first of which was in March of 2020. Throughout these workshops, there have been 100 participants across the 42 online workshops, and these participants are from different groups, including Indigenous representatives, government, non-governmental organizations, industry, and academia. And these workshops are basically used to follow the steps of the conservation standards. In this context, what conservation means to the Inner Bay of Fundy Conservation Plan process is protecting key ecological attributes, which include identified important habitat in the area and the species that live within them, and then minimizing risks to these key ecological attributes. So based on this background, my research questions are, what are the challenges and successes of applying the conservation standards to the Inner Bay of Fundy Conservation Plan process? And how can the Inner Bay of Fundy Conservation Plan process case study inform future planning initiatives in the Inner Bay of Fundy and beyond? So I did this by conducting a traditional literature review, also called a narrative literature review. And this helped me to gain some context on the conservation standards, the Conservation Measures Partnership, and also the Inner Bay of Fundy, including its ecology, ecological and cultural significance. And this helped me to better understand the area and the standards of which I was working with. Second, I constructed a timeline using available documents from the workshops from 2020 to 2024. This included PDFs of the slides that were used during these workshops, as well as the parking lot, which is basically a big document where the workshop participants put any questions or tasks to be completed at a later date. And workshop recordings, which were available from workshops from 2023 in September onwards. And finally, I created a survey. This included 25 category selection, short answer, and Likert scale questions. The Likert scale I used was strongly disagree to strongly agree, with disagree, neutral, and agree in between. This was distributed to all participants of the workshops, both present and past, through email. And the survey asked participants about their experiences throughout the Interbay Funding Conservation Plan process, about their participation length, why they were participating, what they believed the perceived successes and challenges were. So the results of my timeline, this basically outlined outputs, decisions, and milestones throughout the Interbay Funding Conservation Plan process workshops. So you can see the timeline split up into two here, just so you can see it better. The workshop started in March of 2020. This was the first workshop, and they started the assess step of the conservation standards, which you can see circled at the top of the wheel in red. And this involved defining scope, the purpose of the project, targets, so that what they wanted to conserve, the team, and the mission. And then in July of 2021, they were midway through step assess. There was a situational analysis, so understanding the conservation situation in the area, priority situations, what are important to conserve, indicator ratings, how do we know if something's healthy, and identifying knowledge gaps. In February 2022, about 2 years later, step one was finished. Targets and the viability of these targets were identified. Pressures, so what makes things difficult to conserve, what are the issues at hand, indicators and preliminary strategies to achieve some goals were outlined. Then in March 2022 to February 2023, there was about a year-long pause in workshops. And then in June 2023, step two plan was underway, which you can see circled in the blue off to the right-hand side of the wheel there. And this started introducing and discussing the goals of the process. And then moving on to today, fall of 2024, step two plan is ongoing. Goal development has been completed. And strategy creation is ongoing. So figuring out how the ways in which to solve the identified goals. And then the results from the survey. So I received 16 responses to the survey, which was about a 15% response rate. And the main insights from the survey included participation length and reasons. So how long people participated and why they joined, why they continue to stay. Fluency and understanding regarding the conservation standards. So how would people know the conservation standards? And successes and challenges of applying the conservation standards to a planning framework, to a planning process in practice, including ways to amplify these successes and solutions to these challenges. So I have a few graphs up here. The first one at the bottom left corner is the distribution of survey participants. So half the survey participants were from non-governmental organizations, a quarter were from government, an eighth were from Indigenous organizations, and the other eighth were from industry. So you can see that academia is missing here. That's primarily due to the fact that there's only a few participants from academia, and most of them that were involved in this in the process were also involved in designing my survey, and so they could not answer because that would be a conflict of interest. But we have a pretty good representation of different perspectives from different organization types. And on the right-hand side, you can see two graphs. The top graph talks about people's understanding of the conservation standards. So you can see the summary of the themes of each question: familiarity, basic understanding, fluency with the conservation standards, and then would benefit from greater fluency. So you can see that overall people had a pretty positive attitude. They were familiar and had a basic understanding of the conservation standards, but their fluency wasn't great and would therefore benefit from greater fluency with the conservation standards. The second graph is about benefits and outputs of participating in the conservation plan process. through workshops. So people identified relationship building, increased knowledge on the Inner Bay of Fundy community, its ecological and cultural importance, the conservation standards framework as benefits, as well as knowledge sharing, seeing their organization's contributions reflected in the workshops. And then also, again, that they would benefit from increased conservation standards fluency. So again, a really positive reaction. People are responding positively to the process, which is really great to see. So some main themes that came out of the survey were fluency and understanding regarding the conservation standards. So a general pattern that came up was that the more time people spent participating in workshops, or the more workshops that they attended, they had a better understanding of the conservation standards. So more time put in, further understanding. But generally, people would benefit from greater fluency overall. Some of the main successes of the participating in the workshops were knowledge sharing, learning, further understanding of the conservation standards and its applications to conservation planning processes and practice, professional development, and also relationship building with other participants. And some main challenges were a lack of clarity, that the process was time consuming, it was taking a long time, it's been 4 years and they're only on step 2 of 5. And also that participants had varying levels of understanding. So some people who had been participating for longer, or maybe had more experience in the field before joining, would know more and be able to maybe contribute more meaningful things in participants' opinion than themselves. So that might have been a barrier for them to participation. So based off of this, I developed a set of recommendations. So learning what I did from the timeline and the survey, I used a lot of the participant feedback to create 4 main recommendations. So the first is introducing some smaller session or breakout groups within workshops. A lot of people identified that talking in front of a group, normally in workshops, there would be an average participant rate of 25 to 30 people. When you don't know these people, and especially when it's online, it's kind of nerve-wracking speaking up on an online call. So people identified that smaller session or breakout groups within workshops would help them feel more comfortable talking about talking through the steps and working through these steps of the standards. So smaller sessions or breakout groups within workshops, maybe about 5 or 6 people, depending on participation rates per workshop, could help people feel more comfortable and also maybe improve efficiency. Maybe more can get done with smaller groups. The second is establishing a clear timeline for completing each step of the conservation standards. So for the Inner Bay of Fundy conservation plan process, this can be done as soon as possible. People indicated that they weren't really sure when each step was supposed to be completed or what time the entire process was going to be done. And so having a clear timeline will help people to be motivated and also understand what they're working towards. And then for other conservation plan processes, this can just be done at the beginning of the process so people understand what they have to work towards and how much time they might be committing to this process. The third is increasing transparency surrounding expected outputs and outcomes. So this kind of ties in with the timeline, but just more generally understanding what you expect to get out of this process, what you're working towards. And yeah, again, this transparency will help participants understand and become more invested in the process. And finally, optional special sessions on the conservation standards framework. So a key theme was that people wanted further fluency with the conservation standards. And because these are applicable to conservation planning, and not just in this case, it is very beneficial to have this extra education on the conservation standards. So having special sessions that are optional, you can choose to attend them separate from workshops, but that can help people increase their conservation standards fluency and will allow them to contribute more fully to the conservation plan process as a whole. Here are my references. I would like to thank my supervisors, Maxine Westhead and Patricia Emanuel. I would like to thank my internship host and the organization that funded my research, Ocean Frontier Institute's Benthic Ecosystem Mapping and Engagement Project. My second reader, Jason Nog, guidance from Corella Lard, Bertram McDonald, and the Marine Affairs Program faculty. And finally, to my fellow MMMs, my family, my mom who's here today, who flew from Toronto to come see me, and all my friends in the program and outside the program that have supported me throughout this process. Thank you so much.
Let's we'll take a question from the audience. Again, if you could just repeat the question, that'd be great. We'll start with Scott.
Great presentation, Georgia. We love adaptive answer. The process, like, it's a cyclical process, and so far it's progressed kind of A to B to C.
Right.
Part one, do you think that it will continue to go that way? And part two would be, how would like the cyclical nature of government and the 4-year cycle of it kind of influence progress of moving through these stages?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so Scott asked about the cyclical nature of the standards, just sort of how it's gone so far through the standards. Have I seen that cyclical nature? And then with the cyclical nature of government, will these standards be able to, be achieved in that cyclical way? So the first question, I would say that looking through the workshop documents, I think though it is kind of assess was started and completed and then moved on to plan, there was definitely times during the plan process and continues to be where the scope and vision are referred back to and also altered. So there was a vision that the planning committee of the workshops had kind of set out at the beginning of the first workshop, just kind of sort of an idea of the vision, but had sort of shared that it was something that could be changed and adapted as more people joined, and sort of that the creation of a shared vision among participants was really important. So that kind of shows the reverting from plan back to the assess process about vision. And yeah, you're always revisiting past steps, looking at the conservation situation. Obviously, over 4 years, the conservation situation has evolved in the region. And so, yeah, there's definitely lots of revisiting, especially between the first 2 steps. For the second part of your question, that's something that's really interesting because the cyclical nature of government, it's always, is there going to be more funding for this project? Like, how long can it continue? And a lot of that's kind of up in the air. Right now, there's not a super set end date that I know of for the project, which is, again, something I recommended, just kind of creating a preliminary timeline for that with all the knowledge available. But yeah, I think it's definitely a concern with changing over of governments, and there's always a concern that, a project might not be able to be finished, but you obviously hope that it can be. I hope that answers your question.
We'll go to
Georgia, great presentation. Thank you for that. My question is, one of your successes was that this project seems to have good collaboration and meaningful collaboration, but then one of the downfalls is that it's taking a long time.
Yeah.
And I guess what are your thoughts on the dynamic between collaboration, which takes time to be meaningful, and people feeling like things are taking forever? What are your thoughts on balancing, I guess, that kind of thing?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for the question. So Abby asked about sort of balancing the success that people shared of they really enjoyed collaboration, knowledge sharing, and relationship building, but then people identified that the timeliness of the process was frustrating. And that was something really interesting when I was looking at the survey results. I was like, oh, okay, so people really like this, but also don't like this aspect of it. But obviously, collaboration and relationship building takes time. And so there wasn't really a part of the survey that asked, like, would you rather like this take a long time, but it's like, do you want to build relationships with people? Are you okay with it taking a long time? Like, there wasn't really a question of the survey that asked about that. But I think that people value relationship building a lot. And I think it's really important within the conservation community, especially in terms of having diverse stakeholders, so people from industry and people from Indigenous organizations, and having those different perspectives and bringing them together in the interdisciplinary nature of the conservation standards is really important. And I think that a lot of the frustration just comes from people not knowing when it will end. So I think the establishment of like preliminary timeline, just kind of showing people what to expect, might help sort of ease some of that frustration. And I think that while it's taking a long time, people still really value collaboration.
Yes, you, great presentation.
Thank you.
You used the term fluency quite a bit in your presentation.
Mhm.
I wanted to know like what, I don't even know if this is what is good fluency, but like what would good communication within this process look like? Because you spoke on the fact that depending on when people enter the project, you have different knowledge levels and different also abilities to share whether they're comfortable. And so being able to have documentation or science communication that's accessible for people of all backgrounds to understand is a good thing to like set these things in motion. So like what does that like good communication in a project like this, what does that look like?
Yeah, thank you so much. So Emma asked about kind of fluency and transparency and what good communication within this project and process would look like. So one thing I want to highlight that I didn't have time for in this, but that is in my paper, is that all workshop documents used to inform any decisions or to guide the process are available in a Google Drive folder for all participants, so they can refer back to this at any point. And so I think that transparency and that accessibility is really important. I think that in terms of fluency and transparency and communication, obviously it can be improved. In my recommendations, I talk about sort of sharing the timeline, and I think that's a big part of it. Just letting people kind of into the inner workings of the process, especially within the kind of planning team and leadership. You know, sharing what's next for the next meeting, sharing what you're looking to achieve in the next 3 months, 6 months, year. Yeah, just being very open and honest about the process, what you know and what you don't know. I think that's really important.
One last question.
Good job, Georgia. I'm wondering, I have two questions. What was the most surprising thing you encountered throughout the project? You asked me that yesterday. And do you feel hopeful that, like, through this process, the conservation is going to occur in the integrated family? Or do you feel hopeful that the whole project?
Thanks, Laura. So Laura asked what surprised me the most, and then do I feel hopeful that conservation will be achieved in the Inner Bay funding? What surprised me the most, I think, is how many people identified successes, but also challenges that kind of conflicted, just like kind of what Abby talked about, that people really liked collaboration, but complained that it was taking a long time. And it's interesting when a lot of these benefits and successes kind of conflict with each other. Yeah, I think that surprised me a lot. I mean, it makes sense why, but I think just the amount of responses I received that were very conflicting, even from like the same individuals. Some people say, oh, I really like relationship building, but this is taking so long, I don't know when it will end. And so it's like, but these things go hand in hand. Like to have that relationship building, you need to put in the time, you need to put in the work, and it's going to take a while. But I guess just using tools to mitigate this as much as possible, like I explained in my recommendations, is important. And then in terms of conservation and the Inner Bay Fundy, I'm pretty optimistic. There are other initiatives other than this, government-led and community-led and led by non-governmental organizations. And I think a lot's being done. I think that awareness is really being raised for this important and unique region. And I think that with lots of people invested and lots of people that care, we can help to protect and conserve the area.
Thanks, Joy. The first session, we will have a break for 20 minutes and we will reconvene for the final session at at 11 o'clock.
All right, for our online audience, in case you didn't quite catch that, we will be resuming here in a little while after a coffee and mushroom break. So please feel free to just stay and join us back here. We'll give you a little bit of a heads up before we return. Thanks.
I am looking at media language dynamics. This is the basis for much of my research. So I think it's very important to begin with informing you all about the journalistic principles that guide a lot of the media. Journalistic principles are, as with any industry, the guiding factors for journalists. All industries have best practices that are meant to follow, and this ensures that journalists are able to maintain public trust within their reporting. These can be summarized into three overarching categories of independence, accuracy, and fairness and balance. Independence includes the duty that the journalists have to the public. They owe this loyalty to the public above all other entities, and they serve as independent monitors of power, holding people accountable for their actions or inactions. They also have a duty to maintain free from external influences and internal assumptions within their reporting. Accuracy involves the pursuit of truth within journalism, such as verifying information, facts, and quotes that's included within their written pieces, using accurate language and phrasing that represents the reality of the situation rather than stereotyping, and including relevant and adequate context that works to inform the public not only about what is happening, but also about what has led to the events. Lastly, fairness and balance involves using professional judgment within making editorial decisions, such as who is included within a written piece and where they are included. This also requires journalists to fairly represent individuals within their writing, and including a diversity of sources, quotes, and perspectives, and providing reasonable time for all interviewees and anyone involved within the events to respond to allegations or claims. All this contributes to the fact that language is not neutral, and the words that we use have a very significant impact. This is only heightened with breaking news media, as it's often the first, if only, piece of news that the public engages with. Additionally, this is heightened when we're talking about conflicts surrounding Indigenous peoples and their access to resources and implementing their rights. Canada does have a history of reporting on Indigenous conflicts that is unfair and unrepresentative of what is happening, and this trickles down to how Indigenous peoples are perceived in this. Although there's a long history, I wanted to focus on an event that was more recent, specifically what happened in Sonyaville in 2020 in relation to the fisheries. What happened here was on September 17th of 2020, Sabaganagadi First Nation was celebrating the 21st anniversary of the Marshall decisions. In celebration, they launched their own self-regulated fishery. However, the celebration was met with protests by non-Mi'kmaq commercial harvesters and ensuing conflicts on and off the water. The basis for these protests was claimed to be conservation concerns for the health and sustainability of lobster populations. This then led me to ask, how do language choices within breaking news media impact the representation of lobster fishery disputes, specifically between Mi'kmaq and non-Mi'kmaq lobster harvesters? To do this, I did a media analysis using Voyant, which is a free public online media analysis tool. I looked at an overview of 17 breaking news articles that were published between September 1st, 2020 and December 31st, 2020. These were all published within 36 hours of the event that they were reporting on, hence the breaking news timeline. And then 6 of those 17 articles were then selected to do a more in-depth analysis. Based on the analysis, the results indicated that language choices do have a significant impact made within the breaking news media, and this greatly impacts the representation of the lobster fishery disputes and how the Mi'kmaq and non-Mi'kmaq harvesters are portrayed within it. I separated the results into the 3 journalistic principles, as this is how I explored them. First, independence was examined. I wanted to note that within independence, it's near impossible to tell if a journalist has been influenced by bias or internal assumptions unless they have outwardly stated it. Because of this, I couldn't tell this within the articles. However, I was able to explore accountability within the articles. And the journalists and the writing allowed interviewees to shift the responsibilities of their actions, particularly violent ones, to others through the language use. One example of this was saying that for example, authorities such as DFO had created the situations that led to these violent actions. Sorry, need to breathe. The journalists also allowed their interviewees to criticize authorities through quotes in DFO, or through quotes, such as with the RCMP or DFO. This allowed them to maintain accountability with the actions that were being taken. And this language is exemplified through saying that one party was pointing the finger at an authority. Lastly, there was a reliance on bias and jargon within the language, such as referring to Mi'kmaq harvesters as fishing illegally or out of season, or referring to the protests as disputes, conflicts, and tensions rather than protests. Within accuracy, the language often misrepresented the reality of the events and what was happening. As mentioned, protests were often referred to as disputes, conflicts, or clashes, and this did not represent the reality of what was happening between these two groups. Rather than two groups being on the opposing sides of the same reason for these protests, it was groups that were conducting these protests for different reasons. So commercial harvesters were concerned about conservation, while Mi'kmaq harvesters were just attempting to exercise their rights. So they did not have the same reasoning for these protests. Additionally, there was the softening of violent actions through language. This was shown through referring to arson as just the burning of a van, or thefts of lobster traps as their removal. This also contributed to a lack of quality and appropriate context within the articles. Although the Marshall decisions were often referenced within the articles, it was often the same one or two sentences that were regurgitated across them. This also did not represent what had led to Marshall, the long case that it was, the clarifications that resulted from it, and how this is impacting the events to date. There was also a little fact checking that was done, again, in relation to Marshall and moderate livelihood fisheries. Moderate livelihood fisheries were often referred to as being unsanctioned or conducting out of season. This wasn't fact checked, and within the context of the Marshall decision, this was inaccurate. However, this was repeated over and over again. Sorry. Not the most tech savvy. And then lastly, within fairness and balance, Mi'kmaq harvesters were given positions of importance within the articles. They were often included within the headlines and within the first third of articles. They were also often quoted before non-Mi'kmaq commercial harvesters. However, the voices and opinions of both Mi'kmaq and non-Mi'kmaq commercial harvesters were often used to contradict each other rather than emphasize their points. This was unfair to why both parties were upset with what was happening. Additionally, quotes that were included did not represent a diversity in sources. The quotes were often from officials from both sides. So on the Mi'kmaq harvesters, it was from chiefs or community authorities or leaders. From the commercial harvester side, it was often the spokespeople for the alliance or the fisheries unions. Regular everyday people were often left out of these quotes and not provided the opportunity to speak. And then in relation to this, Mi'kmaq harvesters were often given less time to respond to allegations with statements such as unable to reach spokespeople. I could spend a lot of time guessing on why this is, but it was just a fact that they were given less time. Within this, it's also really important to acknowledge what was missing within the articles, because this also paints a picture of the events. Although conservation was cited as the concern for non-Mi'kmaq commercial harvesters and the basis for these protests, this was often missing from the articles and the science was not there. It was stated repeatedly, such as in the statement from CBC, that there was a concern for stocks, but this wasn't actually represented across any of the articles. For example, there is a large size discrepancy between the fleets of non-Mi'kmaq and Mi'kmaq commercial harvesters. This also impacts the amount of lobster they are able to catch and does not account for the conservation concerns. Additionally, any dips in the populations are to be expected. Lobster populations are impacted by natural flows and seasonal changes, as well as the impacts that we've seen in climate change. They naturally go through increases and decreases within their population, and this was never really addressed within the articles. And lastly, DFO spokespeople had come out and said that the lobster health and sustainability was not a concern to them at this time, but this was only really included in 1 or 2 articles and didn't come across the in-depth analysis that was done. With this, the findings revealed that breaking news media failed to follow journalistic principles and practices. Rather than focusing on the reality of the situation and what was happening, for example, again, the conservation concerns for non-meat-mouth commercial harvesters and the attempt to exercise and implement their rights by meat-mouth harvesters, it focused instead on the conflict between the 2 groups. This was shown in the language that was used, quotes, and how they were placed within the structure of the journalistic, within the articles. This highlights an ongoing challenge of properly covering fisheries disputes, particularly when the reality of those involved is misrepresented. And this is important to understand within reporting on Indigenous conflicts. With this, I have several key recommendations. I have many more that I could go into and have gone into in my paper, but for the sake of time, so I'm not rambling at you guys for hours, I'm presenting to you the ones I've directed at both journalists and the public. These are both key to preventing misinformation and disinformation spreading and accurately representing what's happening. So first, I recommend that journalists follow the journalistic principles of independence, accuracy, and fairness and balance. These exist and are standards within the industry. News outlets have them on their websites, and this is taught within journalism schools. However, there's just that disconnect in exercising the principles when reporting and breaking news. I also recommend to push for the further adoption of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action, particularly 84 and 86, which are directed at the mainstream media and breaking news media. These are designed to continue reconciling, fairly representing individuals, and providing them equal opportunity. I also recommend that journalists attempt to decolonize their reporting by remaining educated and informed on the background of what Indigenous peoples have gone through within Canada. This includes both a national understanding as well as more specific understanding within their provinces. For the public, there's also work that needs to be done. Breaking news serves as a good introduction to topics. However, the public must understand that breaking news articles most often do not always provide the full picture of what's happening. This means they have to look at news with a critical lens, as well as consulting a variety of sources to get a better understanding of what's happening. It's important that while breaking news will introduce people to these topics, they seek out other information. And to end, I would just like to reemphasize that language is not neutral, and the words we're using do have an impact in both the rights implementation and access to resources and their management. Breaking news can serve as a useful tool for public engagement with science, conservation, sustainability concerns, and the defense of Indigenous peoples and their rights to resources. However, we must acknowledge how our words have an impact in doing this. With this, I would like to thank everybody. I want to thank Megan and Trina, who are both in the room today, my co-supervisors, Maureen Gugu, who graciously accepted to be my second rater. I'm very lucky to have everyone on my side. I would also like to thank the SOBI Fund for Oceans for allowing me to do this research and making it possible. And of course, everyone in MAP and my MMM friends and my family and friends at home. Thank you.
Any questions? Any student questions? Any student questions other than Scott? Oh, here we go, Emma.
Hi. That was very, very interesting, and this is a subject that I find personally very interesting and maybe want to pursue in the future. My question is regarding your media analysis. I know you spoke mostly about the literature, but in the articles that you came across during your analysis, the choice of photo or like the visuals that went along with the actual text, I don't know if you could speak a little bit about the importance of photography as a medium in this case, because I find in like the 24-hour news cycle, the photo that accompanies a body is what people kind of remember when they think about that article. And I was wondering if you found that it was, the choice of photos were like incited a certain opinion or kind of, if you could touch on that at all.
Yeah, so it wasn't something that I was able to explore in depth for this project just because of time. It wasn't something in the scope, but I can speak just on what I generally noticed, like at the beginning stages before I had this very scoped down. Imagery is very impactful. I think we can all speak to that when we are skimming a news article. Oftentimes people will skim, stop at the picture, and then just read the caption. So they do have a big impact. I also find they're often similar to the language used to get a reaction out of people within the articles, specifically when talking about the lobster pounds and the events that happened there in 2020 with the burning of vehicles and the concerns over lobster that were kept in the pounds. There was lots of images of just dead lobster laying out on the ground, and in reference to that, it was talking about how these were Mi'kmaq lobsters and that they were the cause of this, when in reality, they weren't the ones that removed them from the pound. They weren't the ones that took them out of the traps, laid them out all on the ground to see, weren't holding them up for pictures. So while I couldn't do it justice in like this project going through it, I think it follows very similar patterns, and it is important to understand what we're reflecting within the images we include and if it's contributing to the story or changing the narrative. Because again, oftentimes people are being introduced to these topics for the first time through breaking news and just skimming. So yeah, I don't know if that answers, but thank you.
I don't think you went over it, but with so many news articles in this space coming from a single author, how did you go about choosing your 6 articles for in-depth? And as a kind of aside from that, do you think that scientific knowledge and understanding of what conservation means and the science behind it influences how people are able to report these in a fair way?
So, two-parter, let's see if I remember it by the time I get to the second half. So for choosing my 6 articles, I focused on including one article from each source. So I wasn't able to get into it here, but Global News, National Post, Saltwire, CTV, CBC, I had 6 different outlets and I included one from each. So some of them, there was only one article that fit in the breaking news timeline, so that was really easy. And then the others, it was just, I had to pick, and I basically chose ones that were either really good examples or like better examples, I should say, and ones that did show this clear bias, just to provide a big representation of the different ways that people can report on these same issues, which was also really interesting because I think 2 of the articles were reporting on the same lobster pound burning. So it was interesting to see if the language followed the same patterns. Second half of that question again.
Yeah, there we go. The second half is, so part of the articles you talk about conservation and how there's a conservation risk, yet the science is saying something completely different. Do you think that scientific knowledge within a journalist is valuable or important while they're reporting on these issues in terms of getting those facts accurate?
I think it is, but it's also difficult because at the end of the day, journalists are going to school to be journalists. They're not going to do scientific research most of the time. Sometimes their paths change or cross and they're able to have that knowledge and use it within their writing. But a lot of the time they don't. A lot of the times they're reporting on a topic either because there's no one else to report on it or it is of interest to them. So that having that understanding can impact the way that conservation is achieved through journalism and the way that we're reporting on these issues. But it's difficult because it's how do you maintain that scientific accuracy? And I think a lot of it does come down to academics and scientists when we're trying to get this news out, being aware of how we're framing this and using language that's very accessible and trying not to use a ton of jargon and represent it accurately in a way that anyone can understand, because otherwise journalists are just taking what they have internalized or what they're able to remember. So, thank you.
One last question over here.
You can catch me after.
Great job, Kaylee. You should be very proud.
Don't make me cry.
I'm wondering, I feel like a lot of journalism is reactive, like it's reporting on an event that happened, like quickly. I'm wondering what you would like to see from like a more proactive approach, talking about this historic issue of, you know, this unjust portrayal of Mi'kmaq people in the media.
I think there are a couple things that could be done. For the sake of time, I'll quickly go over a couple, but education is incredibly important. So whether it's within journalism school or within working in the industry, having this ability to educate oneself or educate the ones that you're teaching. So a lot of, I can't speak to CBC and CTV and outlets specifically, but most places you work have this specific training that gives you information on what is needed to do your job. So for oftentimes people who are reporting on conflicts specifically within Indigenous communities tend to report on them over and over again. So providing them that knowledge to properly report if that's what they're going to be, you know, spreading information on. Journalism school as well, it can be incredibly important. Trina does great work within the journalism school at King's. So providing upcoming journalists or inspiring journalists the background knowledge to understand the way that they report on these issues and how it has an impact. Again, specific courses on Indigenous peoples and their histories within the areas that you're going to be reporting on. A lot of it does come down to education and just doing that work, whether it's through the organization you're with or on your own. Thank you, Bethany.
Hey, thank you, Kaylee.
BBC
Yeah, and yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. I honestly.
Something you want
Yeah,
to do
it's so
Yeah.
That's on.
People be up.
Okay, everyone. Our second presentation is from Michael Fabiano, who's speaking about Beyond Fish, exploring the social outcomes of hatcheries in Atlantic salmon conservation.
Okay, is this on? Can everyone hear me all right? Oh, not yet. Okay.
Yeah.
Better.
There we go.
There it is. All right, so as Dr. Kevin so kindly introduced me, My name is Michael, and I'm going to be talking to you guys about salmon and hatcheries for the next 13 minutes. So Atlantic salmon are in trouble. It's an unfortunate reality. Stocks have been declining in the Maritimes for over 2 decades now, and many populations have been extirpated or are at risk of extirpation. This is of concern as salmon are an incredibly important species of fish. They carry immense significance for indigenous communities, the ecosystem, the economy, and the culture of this region. There are many clear reasons for their decline, which include damming, overharvesting, destruction of habitat, pollution, invasive species, and climate change, to name a few. Those are all givens though, right? We can look at that list and very clearly see how they are linked to the decline seen in salmon. However, this final factor that I'm about to mention has been so heavily contested to the point that we are still doing it, and that is hatcheries and stocking, growing fish in captivity and releasing them into the wild. The very thing we are doing to help increase salmon abundance may be contributing to their decline. Stocking takes place for a variety of reasons, including to increase recreational catch, as mitigation for habitat destruction, and in some cases to bring back depleted populations. The logic behind stocking and hatcheries is as so. The early life stages of salmon have an incredibly high mortality rate in the wild. Some estimates put it as high as 99%. So by decreasing this mortality rate at these critical life stages through a little human intervention, we should theoretically have more fish. However, virtually all the natural science literature on hatcheries and stocking points to their detrimental effects on wild salmon populations. This is due to the negative behavioral, physiological, epigenetic, and genetic impacts of the hatchery rearing environment, more broadly known as the hatchery effect. When these, what some would call inferior hatchery raised fish, are released, they interact with wild individuals, diluting local genetic adaptations and increasing competition for wild fish. Despite these facts, there are currently 9 hatchery facilities engaged in anadromous Atlantic salmon stocking in the Maritimes, all utilizing different methods to reach different goals. This begs the question, why do we stock? While some literature would chalk this up to delusion in believing we can solve any issue with human ingenuity or an inability to let go of the act of stocking itself, my research explores some of the social outcomes that are produced by these hatcheries that fall outside the actual production of fish. While they do not counteract the negative effects hatchery and stocking activities have on salmon populations, these social outcomes could explain why hatcheries remain open. These social outcomes align with socio-ecological systems thinking, which emphasizes that systems involve complex interactions between social and biophysical components. A common issue in many conservation efforts is an overemphasis on the biophysical aspects while neglecting social dimensions. Socio-ecological system thinking emphasizes that effective conservation must consider both of these factors. The maritime hatchery debate can be seen as a socio-ecological system. Historically, DFO's management of this issue has placed an overemphasis on the biophysical components, such as the genetic integrity and ecological impacts of hatcheries, while neglecting the interconnected social dimensions. This imbalance has resulted in the current management state where scientists continue to point out the negative ecological and genetic impacts of hatcheries, yet hatcheries continue to persist. Something is not working here, and as per the socio-ecological system literature, it could be not considering both sides of this socio-ecological system. So in my research, I've aimed to describe and characterize the complex outcomes facilitated by these hatchery facilities. 4 hatcheries were included in my paper as case studies. These include the Fraser's Mills and Marguerite hatcheries owned by the province of Nova Scotia, the Coldbrook Biodiversity Facility owned by the federal government, and the Miramichi Salmon Conservation Center owned by the Miramichi Salmon Association. My primary research method was interviews. 34 people were interviewed for the study. The perspectives gathered includes those of employees from the case study hatcheries, as well as individuals closely connected to these facilities and members of the broader Atlantic salmon conservation community. My theoretical approach for doing this work was grounded theory. Grounded approaches are useful to generate theory regarding the reality of a subject or phenomenon that is grounded in the data itself. An important aspect of this approach is the iterative process of data analysis, which basically means getting to know the data through spending a lot of time reviewing it over and over and over again. An open coding approach was used to analyze this data. Coding is when Sentences or ideas are attached a code to summarize or categorize it. From there, codes are grouped into code families, and then into larger themes, which form the basis of my results. On the right, there's an example from the code book I used in the study. You can see the overarching theme of the future of salmon at the top, and then all the codes that feed into it below. As these different codes, families, and themes arose, I discussed them with my supervisor to situate them in the bigger picture and as part of the iterative process of data analysis. So in addition to interview data, another way I further immersed myself in this research was through interacting with salmon and the people who raised them in the areas that they were trying to protect. As you've seen and will see throughout the rest of this presentation, I have a lot of photos of salmon on my phone. And these are taken from moments when I've been fortunate enough to interact with these fish through hatcheries at their various life stages. This photo here is from a particular high point in my research where I was able to release an adult salmon into the Petitcodiac watershed as part of the Fundy Salmon Recovery Project. These experiences were also part of my methods as they allowed me to engage with and understand this topic on a deeper level. Some of the social outcomes produced by these hatchery facilities as presented through the data are shown here. Perspectives on the successes and failures of the current governance structure were also frequently shared, and I'm going to dive into them all a little bit more now. So hatchery facilities acting as a form of grassroots conservation. These facilities acted as hubs for all sorts of science and conservation work to take place. As seen in this quote here, groups from local river organizations to NGOs, to universities, to provincial and federal governments, all had ties to these hatcheries. And so because of all this, all types of salmon work would be done by these hatchery groups themselves or facilitated through these hatchery groups. As seen in this quote here, many participants viewed these hatchery groups as doing more for Atlantic salmon than DFO themselves. Another outcome produced by these hatcheries was them being repositories for local knowledge. Knowledge on how to effectively rear Atlantic salmon using the specific hatchery was passed down from generation to generation through hatchery managers. As salmon stocks continue to decline in the Maritimes, this knowledge may become increasingly important. Shifting focus to hatcheries as a way to cope with ecological anxiety, many participants expressed deep fears and concerns about the future of Atlantic salmon, often drawing examples from their grandchildren and fear that they won't be able to experience and benefit from salmon the same way that they were able to, as showcased in this quote here. This aligns with the concept of ecological anxiety, feelings of distress about environmental degradation and loss. And the photo here really showcases the basis of this worry. I wish I got a better photo, but this photo is of the fish return board at the Mactapac Biodiversity Facility, a federally owned hatchery that intercepts fish as they travel up the St. John River. While this is not a facility discussed in my case study, it showcases the drastic decline being seen in salmon in the Maritimes, as this location went from seeing 702 fish in 2019 at the bottom there to just 83 fish in 2023, and reports from this year indicate that that number is still dropping. For many, hatchery facilities offered a glimmer of hope amidst all this salmon decline, that through human intervention, Atlantic salmon populations may continue in the Maritimes. Hatcheries were seen as a way to help salmon along as participants felt they owed it to the fish. Hatcheries were also seen as a way for people to connect to salmon, fostering the human-salmon relationship. This connection to salmon was seen to be very valuable, as many participants expressed the belief that conservation action requires connections between humans and the resource. As this quote so eloquently puts, it's the connection to the fish that drives this conservation. Hatcheries were seen to support the connection to salmon in two primary ways. Many participants identified hatcheries as key to supporting angling as a form of connection to fish. Participants view these hatcheries as boosting fish populations, which in turn lead to better angling opportunities, participation, and success rates. These hatcheries also facilitated non-extractive forms of connections to fish through education programs like the Fish Fed program, where school students got little mini hatcheries in their classrooms and got to watch salmon from the egg to the fry stage, all while learning a curriculum about Atlantic salmon. This promotes education, which also leads to connection to and care for the salmon. So while this research highlights the numerous social outcomes associated with this hatchery, it is crucial to emphasize that this should not be misconstrued as justification for stocking solely due to social reasons. Remembering the socio-ecological system, conservation only works when both the biophysical and social components are considered together. This work has aimed to highlight the social outcomes of this system so that they may be adequately considered alongside the ecological and genetic arguments when management decisions are made. The intent of this research is to complement and not replace the current hatchery management practices. So moving back to management and DFO's management of this issue, many participants expressed concern about how DFO is managing the Atlantic salmon hatcheries in the Maritimes. DFO's management of Atlantic salmon largely followed the prevailing literature of the topic. For a long time, this literature was focused on the ecological and genetic impacts of the hatcheries, and thus management followed suit. However, people who engage with these hatcheries often experience these social outcomes, many of which are now starting to have peer-reviewed backing themselves. This has resulted in a misalignment between the views of the manager and the general public, resulting in conflict. In interviews, this manifested through a perceived lack of care, as displayed in this quote here, a slow pace by DFO, and their overly precautious approaches. So how can these social outcomes be used to improve management practices and get DFO and the general public back on the same page? DFO is currently in the process of developing an Atlantic salmon conservation policy. In 2023, a What We Heard report was put out by DFO regarding their strategy to restore and rebuild Atlantic salmon populations. This report outlines many of the perspectives concerned salmon advocates held in regards to these management plans. In regard to stocking specifically, it outlined a desire to take a more balanced approach to stocking, using stocking as a management tool when appropriate, improving in the management of stocking by providing more guidance, opportunities for collaboration, and improving stocking practices, while also recognizing the utility of hatcheries and stocking and maintaining social, cultural, and ecological connections to salmon for Indigenous communities. The social outcomes highlighted in my research align with many of these sentiments expressed by the general public and offer actionable opportunities to address these perspectives. DFO could increase opportunities for collaboration by engaging with and working alongside these hatchery-based conservation movements. DFO can improve stocking practices by engaging and considering the local knowledge stored within these hatcheries and incorporating it into scientific advancements. DFO can improve management approaches by considering many of the discussed criticisms. And finally, DFO could better recognize the utility of stocking and maintaining social, cultural, and ecological connections to salmon by considering the hatchery's role in acting as a coping mechanism for ecological anxiety and informing connections between humans and salmon. Again, while these hatchery social outcomes should not act as a license to stock in themselves, considering both the social and biophysical components of the system will be key to ensuring a smooth transition and less opposition to whatever future Atlantic salmon conservation measures DFO chooses to pursue. This research will hopefully bring us closer to what truly matters, ensuring current and future generations get to see and benefit from this incredible species of fish. Just quickly, I wanted to thank all the participants of the study, as this would not have been possible without them. I'd like to thank the founders of the project, namely the SSHRC Insight Development Grant, the Nova Scotia Freshwater Fisheries Research Cooperative, and the Fish People Place Lab. I'd like to extend my deepest thanks to Dr. Hannah Harrison for her guidance throughout this project. And finally, I want to thank all my fellow MMM students, the MMM faculty, and my family and friends for supporting me through this project and this program as a whole. Thank you all for listening, and bring on the questions.
Hey, fantastic. Have any questions? See that. Thank you. I don't like the sound. Thank you for your presentation. I thought that your methods were really interesting about the coding your interview transcripts. I was just curious about what methods you used to kind of come up with the themes that your codes went into. Were they developed while you were creating your interview questions, or was it more after the fact?
So the interview questions were pre-established. This is a project that I'm kind of just coming onto. So the interview guide itself was established, but there were some general themes that were looked for in like through those interview questions. But in terms of how they translate it to codes, grounded theory, like really, like you're not really supposed to go into it with preconceived notions. You're supposed to let the data kind of talk to you and I guess form theories based on that. So kind of just as I was going through and coding all these interviews, themes would arise to like come out to me, and then there's this thing called memoing where you can like attach like broader ideas to specific codes as they come up in the actual program or the software. That way you can like keep track of these larger ideas that come up as you're coding. It's all part of like the iterative process. You just like spend a lot of time with the data and things come to you.
Hey, Michael. Sorry. Can you tell us anything about your interview guide? I mean, working through 34 participants, it's a lot of work. Like, what kind of questions were you asking to get such a diverse data set?
Yeah, so like typically interviews would start by, I guess, just really understanding the participants' role in the Atlantic salmon sphere, I guess. And then we get into like what they see the benefits of Atlantic salmon to be. And we interviewed such a wide array of people, from like fishermen to like government employees and stuff like that. So a lot of people had different answers as to like what was valuable to them, but we honestly just tried to like, they're semi-structured in nature, so we can like pivot based on what we heard in the interview, but we would just try and find what salmon meant to them and follow that.
Great presentation, Michael. I just had a question. You have a lot of your recommendations were kind of garnered towards DFO. I'm wondering if you had an opportunity to talk to anyone at DFO or like anybody from the provincial or federal government to like speak of these recommendations and see what DFO can do.
And well, the answer is yes. We have a lot of people close to the project. My second reader is actually on the DFO Atlantic salmon file themselves. So I think just, I guess, having it in front of people at DFO is an important first step in getting these recommendations like realized. And yeah, I guess that's pretty much it. Just like getting in front of people at DFO.
Great presentation, Michael. I loved your photos. Thanks for photo credit. You did a great job of outlining the social importance of this project, but also the genetic problems that DFO highlights. My question is, when you were interviewing people that work at these hatcheries and are involved in these hatcheries, did they recognize these genetic problems and believe in them, and kind of see their social values as balance, or did they not believe in DFO's genetic science? Yeah, I'm just curious on what their perspectives was on the genetic science.
Yeah, there's a wide array of people interviewed in this study, so I don't think I can speak for everyone, but I believe, like, for the most part, people were aware of the genetic concerns that these hatchery facilities offered. However, they were, I remember this one quote that said, like, yeah, I know about the genetics and I'm like concerned about the genetics, but we are going to be so concerned watching and like trying not to mess up their genetics that we're going to watch their genetics disappear. And that's basically like referring to salmon are decreasing in the Maritimes at alarming rates, as seen in the photo there. Like, the situation is pretty dire, and a lot of people don't just want to like sit back and watch the salmon disappear. So like, while they recognize the genetic impacts, they don't want to sit back and watch the salmon disappear.
Cheery note to end on.
Outside of the academic people who are debate this impact, actually it's from days.
Yeah, I'm for one, they're actually like academic. They were just more concerned about like the painting with the broad brush of factories being seen as a way to just solve every and while not addressing the problem. So they were more concerned about like what happened more so than like because honestly so they were just more like they wanted more pragmatic view of it, just to like very perfect, super like specific what we're trying to accomplish. Like the money center recovery where it's just like same right on and they're looking to kind of use that. They don't want to just have to put it together.
Start a little early.
They want specific.
Okay. So next up, we have Aidan McDermott, who is speaking about a study of benthic invertebrates in Passamaquoddy Bay.
Great. All right, first off, I'd like to thank my amazing supervisor, Dr. Claire Goodwin, who is online. I'd also like to thank Dr. Davide Asankar, who's part of the scientific dive team with Huntsman. Peter and Laura from DFO. So this summer I worked in St. Andrews, which is located in Passamaquoddy Bay, part of the larger Bay of Fundy, as you can see here in the red circle. Passamaquoddy Bay is an extremely unique environment, as Bethany mentioned, with the high biodiversity and high abundance of species. However, it's also separated by an island archipelago, which takes the massive tides of the Bay of Fundy and funnels it through narrow passages. This creates an extremely unique environment for benthic invertebrates, and also a challenging environment to dive with down currents, cold water, low visibility. However, with the challenges of scientific diving, several very interesting organisms live there, including Gorgonocephalus, which translates to Medusa's head, or commonly known as the northern basket star. These unique echinoderms are specialized filter feeders with highly branched arms that they use to filter feed krill and plankton from the water column. Historically, they were found abundantly throughout the northern hemisphere and in Passamaquoddy Bay. However, anecdotal accounts of this species indicate that it was extirpated around 2012. My project intended to investigate this species' presence, as well as the presence of two other species, including Jersemia and Alcyonium soft corals. Jersemia soft coral is associated with the juvenile life stage of Gorgonocephalus, which inhabits the coral polyps until it is more developed, when it then leaves and begins filter feeding. As well, these two soft corals are anecdotally reported as either decreasing in abundance or have become extirpated from the Bay of Fundy, Passamaquoddy Bay. With this study, I intended to research three main objectives: compiling historical data sets to create a more complete spatial and temporal picture of the species' presence, identify population declines and investigate possible causes, and provide data-driven recommendations to inform policy and marine management conservation planning. To do this, identified a study area based on a data set created by a man named Art McKay back in 1978. This data set is one of the most extensive and comprehensive dive surveys done in Passamaquoddy Bay, and included the Wolves Archipelago, the Western Isles, and Passamaquoddy Bay. As well, I included Cobscook Bay, which is located in Maine, as I had several observations from the study done in 1992. With these boundaries, I then began to look for data. So some of the secondary data sources that I included GBIF, which is an online data repository of observations from multiple different websites that collect records from citizen science observations and our research grade. Using this and the initial surveys conducted by Art McKay, I then did a spatial analysis between DFO transect data and the original surveys conducted, and made a request to SABS for video transect data. With the video transect data, I went through, I'd say, about 40 hours of video to collect observations of Gorgonocephalus from around 2007 to 2008, as well as several observations of Alcyonium. Based on these observations and all of the secondary knowledge sources, we then conducted dive surveys throughout the Western Isles and Passamaquoddy Bay, focusing on areas where they were known to be historically abundant. With the dive surveys, we conducted a roving dive survey technique, which is very useful in harsh conditions and for very topographical features. With multiple team members, we collected data for video, photography, and physical samples. Based on all the data we collect, we then use a SAC4 analysis, which is a semi-quantitative method of determining species abundance and presence. And then we develop a habitat form to represent the overall species and habitat profile. So based on all of the data that I collected this summer, you can see initially the survey conducted by Art McKay in 1978. There is a significant abundance of this species in Passamaquoddy Bay, with observations varying. And then in 2012, the species was last observed. This corroborated the anecdotal accounts of the species disappearance in Passamaquoddy Bay. As well, I have a data source breakdown here on the right. You can see here the primary source of data was GBIF for these observations. Temporally, I use QGIS to map out species observations in Passamaquoddy Bay and Western Isles. As can be seen on the map, there is a high concentration of observations within the passages of the bay, with the most recent observations just south of Max Island in the center of the map here. Alcyonium soft corals were very hard to find records for, with only formal scientific dive surveys finding observations. As can be seen on the graph, the initial dive surveys conducted by Art McKay found significant abundance of Alcyonium. Video transects conducted by DFO in 2008 found observations of Alcyonium. And in 2024, dive surveys conducted by the Huntsman Science diving team found Alcyonium. However, abundances historically recorded indicate there's quite a decrease in their presence. Data source breakdown, again, GBIF is a primary source for data, and dive surveys conducted by Huntsman supplemented that. Temporally and spatially, we have observations again concentrated in the Western Isles and on the Wolves Archipelago, indicating that these sites are both biologically significant. Results for Drusemmia also had high abundances back in 1978 with the initial surveys conducted by Art McKay. And then further in 2007 and 2006, the DFO video transect surveys again had records of their presence. However, this species is likely to have been extirpated more recently, as observations were last recorded in 2019. The data breakdown here, Art McKay's initial surveys make up the primary observations for Drusemmia in the area. Spatially, again, the Western Isles and the Wolves Archipelago were areas with high abundance of Drusemmia soft corals, indicating their biological significance. Based on the observations and data sets from this study, the importance of baseline data is very important. Two key studies that I used for my project included Daniel Pauly's 1995 paper on shifting baselines, where the increased loss of biodiversity goes unnoticed by succeeding generations. And a 2015 paper by Thurston, which indicates the importance of observations from non-traditional knowledge sources. Species-specific findings from this study included records of Gorgonocephalus being extirpated or suggested to be extirpated by 2013. These were corroborated by several papers I found. One was a mass wasting disease, which occurred in 2012 for all echinoderm species, as well warming waters in the bay around 2012. There's a study done indicating temperatures increased between 1 and 3 degrees Celsius. Observations of Drosemia decline in 2019 were likely caused by sedimentation, but I don't have enough data to statistically support that. Alcyonium is still present, but in a reduced abundance, indicating a need for conservation. So as well here, I have the causes listed. With this study, there were several challenges going back in time with historical records, as many of the data sources used were personal logbooks from divers affiliated with Huntsman and non-digitalized archives, including trawl records in the Huntsman archives and Art McKay's data set, which was digitized into an Excel spreadsheet, but was originally a paper copy. So based on the data, several management recommendations came to mind for this area, including the establishment of a marine protected area for the Western Isles and the Wolves Archipelago. Introducing a marine protected area in this spot would help protect critical benthic habitats, enhance biodiversity, and ecosystem resilience against a lot of the threats the bay is currently facing, including climate change and invasive species. The implementation of no-take zones would help significantly, as benthic habitats and benthic species are very susceptible to activities like bottom trawling, which can help transport invasive species to new locations, such as Dedenum vexillum, which currently cannot reproduce in the bay due to water temperatures, but physical colonies can be moved and established. As well, the use of benthic invertebrates as bioindicators is very important for management purposes and is reflected in documents like the EU Water Framework. These documents emphasize the importance of monitoring species that are non-commercially valuable, but are critical to ecosystem health, like Alcyonium and Gorgonocephalus. Some more management recommendations include enhanced data collection. So from the records I collected, there were several gaps that were either filled in by personal logbooks or from online data sources. However, a standardized surveying management plan would help to reduce gaps and the potential for missing species presence. This could be supplemented by the use of eDNA, which could help look for species in areas where dive surveys are not possible, including deeper waters or areas that are too dangerous to dive survey. Filling in temporal and spatial gaps is also important. Integrating traditional ecological knowledge, as Bethany mentioned, is extremely important, as the Passamaquoddy people have had a very long presence in the area for time immemorial. Their name translates to the people who spear pollock, and their knowledge can help supplement even further back in time, as abundance of species was far higher than we could possibly have recorded.
Hey. Questions?
Thank you for a great presentation. I think a lot of the MMM Cohort, initially when we heard your project and the fact that you were doing some really interesting stuff to the dead, oh my God, this is so cool. What were some of,
I guess just the having to do with your methods in diving in such a difficult spot. Was there a particular amount of, what were the problems that you came with that, and how did you find solutions to diving in, particularly maybe some difficult conditions, and maybe not gathering all the data that you would have wanted, or maybe that you didn't come across those difficulties, and how did you work with them?
So there's several other techniques that you can use to survey besides diving. However, they might not be as effective for sample collection. Drop cameras, ROVs are a good option, but good training is also part of it too. If you're
Good job, Dan. I thought it complemented Bethany's work so well. I love the area of focus. I was just wondering, do you think that, like, since there's a lack of surveying those, it's possible that those species are still like out there in more abundance, or is like it really like dire from the effects?
So currently, like, we are doing biological surveys and baseline data surveys in Passamaquoddy Bay based on the COSIWIC status for species extirpation. If they're extirpated from 5 areas where they're known to be historically present within, I think it's 136 square kilometers, then it suggests extirpation. So, like, we can't confirm the species is gone, however, the lack of observation suggests it.
Great job, Dan. That was awesome. What were you passing around? Is that a northern basket star from Labrador?
It is, yeah. That's one of the samples we collected from.
It's beautiful. It's so cool. I was just going to ask you about the beautiful videos that you made over the summer. I was wondering if you have plans to put any like on the Dive Deeper site so that people can learn more, or do any like kind of youth events or things like that with your potential future work.
Potentially, yeah. We did a expedition up to Labrador this summer, and I'm going to be going through a lot of that video and putting together a species composition for Labrador.
We got more time for more questions.
Yeah, yes, that was a really interesting talk. I knew Art many, many years ago, and he was very concerned about trawling in the bay. Is there still much trawling going on? And if so, for which species?
I know there is currently an active sea cucumber fishery in Passamaquoddy Bay. I won't speak too much to the impacts as they haven't been fully studied. However, I know there was historically also a drag fishery for urchins, and that was really not good for the populations. They crashed after being fished.
Any other questions? I was wondering about how it's such a foreign place to me, right? It's such a like wild and so different from my own kind of life and what I know about. And I'm wondering, like, how do you have any thoughts on kind of how you make people care about those spaces that are so far removed from their daily lives?
One quote comes to mind, and it's "People protect what they love," from Jacques Cousteau. And really, I think people have to see it to fully appreciate it. But unless you're fully immersed, the best proxy is video and pictures, which our photographers do a really good job of.
Now, can I add to that answer too? You could also go back and read some of Rachel Carson's books on the sea, because she verbalized how people can connect to the ocean, even if they're just walking a beach. I mean, diving is probably beyond most people's abilities or interest, but certainly the connection along the coast is crucial. Read Rachel Carson.
Any final questions? Okay, well, thank you.
That was so long. Well, I was. I should get it covered. There's also massive.
Make sure grandma is coming home.
No, the last one is. This one got 15 minutes. Oh.
Yours, my parents. I do have type 5.
Start with that.
It's pretty fun.
No, it's not. That's where I have this. Found the expert on your side.
Can you hear me on mic?
Yeah.
Yeah, is it coming up on?
So this is actually.
Yeah, why don't we wait till
We're gonna wait until 12:15, so if anyone wants to take a second, you can press.
You're in the most pressure right now, right?
I know, I was so focused on.
Oh, so that's why this is
I actually was thinking about yeah, I was considering using that. So much detail. I can do it later, but I make sure that.
Yeah, that's the app.
Just we have more time.
Exactly, yeah. My folks are there. Plane tickets. Yeah. Yeah.
Save that for me.
Yeah, that's the. I gotta save up. You might come to the reception. Should say, you know, last time.
I was like, but I can see right here.
Oh, yeah, I'm just, I told my family. They'd be on I'm like, it's right here. Like, when you think about it, it was, yeah.
Still SWAT.
Yeah, that's the main thing. So.
Yeah, I'm trying not to swat at take one, because that personally.
I mean, everyone's gonna.
Yeah.
Olivia, when I was with her, do you need to go?
One second.
Oh, I did, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I told my kids.
I might try to chop it up here and send it. Yeah. That's one of my favorite Christmas goals. Well, the next 2 weeks, it's gone. A whole lot to do. Starts. Well, really has like Christmas stuff. Yeah. That's why you have the right view. But also please eat all.
So is it clicking? Am I clicking on here? Am I clicking the change or are there arrows?
Try.
It looks like click, but I don't want to go not get so bad.
Max, is it a click or an arrow?
Yeah, you can also use there's a black. Yeah.
No.
Hypothetically
Really, really good.
Yeah. Should be.
Yeah. Is it not switch?
The battery's working. So it's just like.
You can use that.
You see it, but you can just
That's good to figure out. Well, there's arrows down here. Oh, perfect. Perfect. Got all my tools.
Okay, folks.
Oh, yeah.
We've got our last presentation. I think it takes some guts to go last, so.
It's actually late to the sign up page.
Oh, never mind then.
It was the fastest I've ever seen a sign up page fill up.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was, I was impressed. I was impressed. Sorry, Erling.
Okay, well, I'd like to introduce Erling Rosset, who is speaking about Arctic development futures, industry perspectives on Arctic marine development in Canada.
away.
Okay, everyone can hear me all right? Great, good afternoon. My name is Erling Ralseth. I am a Master of Marine Management candidate here at Dalhousie University, and I focus my research on industry development perspectives in the Canadian Arctic. I'm the last one of the day, so I'll keep it short, about 13 minutes of talking and 7 minutes of questions. So this presentation is going to start out with some brief background, mostly historical and legal, as well as climatographic for the region. The area of interest being the Canadian coastal Arctic, so largely the Canadian Arctic archipelago, or the Arctic archipelago, Canadian archipelago. I might refer to it that way during the presentation. My methodology, which I'll be using to break down my results and then later analyze them in my interpretation and discussion, and recommendations, which are going to be a little bit briefer, and then we'll open the floor for questions. So at the moment, the Canadian Arctic is on the precipice of change. The climate is warming 4 times that of the rest of the world, which for ice is not very good news, but for industry could be. So Canada now has a significant amount of time to determine how it wants to progress its development and procedures in the Arctic to allow for safe and sustainable development along ecological, social, and industrial lines in the region. And I'll be using quotes like this to supplement a lot of my understanding today. So if you need during the question period, I'll be happy to go back. Legally, the Canadian Arctic's story begins in 1970 as far as jurisdiction goes, with the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act. Along with a little bit of extra legislation, this allowed Canada to establish a 12 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, which was an increase from the 3 nautical mile statute at the time, as well as a 100-mile pollution-free zone. Something that was highly contested due to the unilateral jurisdiction that provided Canada in its ice-covered waters for the next 22 years until the passing and ratification of the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea's 3rd conference. This actually saw the exclusive economic zone grow to the modern 200 nautical miles and allowed Canada to pass, or at least aid in the writing of Article 234 in UNCLOS, which refers to the unilateral defense and pollution prevention regulations that can be passed by nations in their ice-covered waters. The nomenclature is now kind of up for debate. There's a lot of excellent literature on it. I'm not going to be getting into that. Russia and Canada are currently the 2 leading regimes that have established legal ice-covered water protections in their jurisdictions, which provides protection for both the water surface, column, and benthic regions. In 2010, the NORDREG, or the Northern Canada Vessel Traffic Services Zone, which is a compliance regulation policy that ships must conform to when they're operating in Canadian waters. 2010 became the mandatory extent of that, and you'll see in the figure on the chart here that the NORDREG zone is actually outlined in blue. And when I'm speaking my area of interest, it's largely the yellow line you see moving through the Northwest Passage region of the Arctic archipelago. In 2017, the Polar Code, or the International Code for Safety for Ships Operating in Polar Waters, was passed. That's a combination of the International Maritime Organizations, or IMO's, safety of life at sea regulations and marine pollution prevention regulations, along with special codes for operating in polar waters, which I'll talk about later, and is extremely hazardous in its own unique ways and is also changing with the climate. In 2018, Canada harmonized those regulations with domestic law in the ASFPPR, the Arctic Shipping Safety and Pollution Prevention Regulations. So Canada now sits, as I said, in a very unique position in terms of regulation and the future of what the region is going to look like. There's a lot of uncertainty in terms of how ice patterns and shipping patterns are going to change, manifest, as well as the way that Canada as a federal body and a federalized body, so in terms of the territories and provinces that are going to operate up north, can do so and hopefully do so safely. One of the largest concerns is actually small vessels that are operating under foreign flags due to their lack of recognition and the larger international push to contest Canada's regulation and unilateral legal jurisdiction for internal waters through the Arctic archipelago, which is reflected in the second quote here. My study was a 10-interview qualitative study conducted later in the summer and along the lines of the Oxford Scenario Planning Approach, or the OSPA, originally penned in a book in 2016 by Ramirez and Wilkinson. This was a scenario-based development opportunity that was provided largely for business clients that allowed them to work in seminars and devise how their corporations or bodies were going to move forward in the future when they were sitting on points of change. This was adapted by Middleton et al. In 2021 to actually conform to the Arctic setting and the creation of scenarios through interview processes in an Arctic setting. So applying that to my research seemed like a bit of a no-brainer. It follows a 4-step approach that I worked through in my own adaptation personally with all of my interview participants. Begins with identifying the development drivers in a region given a point of change, which for us was climate change, identifying critical uncertainties from the boiled down themes, building scenarios in tandem with my participants, and then discussing the implications very briefly with those same participants. The 10 interviews collected followed these participants. I de-identified the data and gave them ID numbers and titles to allow for minimal context while also keeping their identity safe and allowing them to speak very freely and candidly, even outside of sometimes their roles in the Arctic. These experts or participants, as I refer to them, were members of government departments that operate in the Arctic, usually bureaucratically, sea-lift firms, which is the primary method of delivery of goods from southern Canada, to northern Canada, and is usually just it's kind of a shipping route that moves up through the water. So if you hear me talk about sea-lift, that's it. Vessel operators, the people that are piloting and driving the ships, and marine training schools, of which there are currently 2 operating exclusively in the Arctic under the Ocean Protection Plan, which provides funding for Indigenous peoples, especially Indigenous women, that want to be more involved in the marine sector. There were 6 interview questions that were asked in a semi-structured interview cycle that allowed me to gain maximum understanding from these very unique participants in my scoping study. So from my results, I identified 6 key drivers, 2 critical uncertainties, and the linear development of 2 scenarios. I'll go over why that last bit is important once I refer to other studies later. This is a brief representation of how the scenarios diverge along my critical uncertainties as the axes of understanding. To distill my development drivers, I took quotes like these manually from my interviews, which took quite a bit of time, and boiled down the key themes, things about important issues that were going to be taking place in the Arctic very soon, and things that were going to ensure or maybe even ensure the change or guarantee a lack thereof, of which I deduced and created 6 development drivers in the region, primarily economic incentives, the northern population, and climate change, as well as infrastructure and technology, political will, and regulatory environment. Economic incentives refers to the internal workings, the external workings of these firms as they're kind of drawn into doing business in and through the Arctic, so transit passage on the Northwest Passage, as well as extractive industries and working with northerners. The northern population is the ability for the government and willingness to engage them, not just their existence, they're not going anywhere. Infrastructure and technology is the very basic ability to operate in harsh northern environments, so very, very extreme temperature changes, and also dealing with the capacity for ice strikes and ice entrapment. Climate change, which affected the North very specifically because of the crumbling of the multi-year ice sheets that now pours into the Arctic archipelago. A lot of Arctic waters around the world are currently ice-free, but in Canada, because of the congestion points and the bottlenecks that are posed in the archipelagic region, we see a lot more congestion and a higher risk of ice strikes from multi-year ice, which will persist until multi-year ice is no longer, which is not going to happen for the next 50 to 75 years, but those numbers are, again, just projections. The political will, something we've heard about a lot of these presentations, the ability for political organs to actually conform to bureaucratic and environmental needs to do what needs to be done, and the regulatory environment, which in the Arctic is a bit messy at the moment. There's a handful of organizations that operate up there. I couldn't get a straight number depending on the operations actually occurring, but it was between 5 and 7, led normally by DFOs, Coast Guard as their operational arm, as well as provincial and territorial governments, and the Transport Canada kind of the organizational charge. Critical uncertainties were deduced from the interview quotes further, usually in terms of things that could vary very heavily, and in that variance would change the outcome of the scenarios and therefore the fate of the Arctic in terms of its future development possibilities. Quotes like these, so things where participants expressed there wasn't a consistent pattern, or they were unable to actually give a year or a timeline for things like climatic change and industrial change in the region. two overarching critical uncertainties were developed from the condensation of the themes that I deduced from my interviews. Primarily government intervention, which is largely the internal workings of the Canadian government as a federalized system in the region. It refers to infrastructure, generation, regulatory bodies, and the health of those bodies, the accessibility of action for Northern Canadians, and federal coordination and support in the region. And then the secondary driver or uncertainty, was the pace of growth, which was largely external factors, so things that would attract foreign business to want to work in the Arctic, to be able to work in the Arctic, the climate change implications, the reduction of multi-year ice over a longer period of time, and allowing business incentives to occur in the region and to do so safely. Scenarios were developed with the idea in mind that there was going to be a 2x2 grid that would look something like the scenario analysis on the left. That is what most scenario analysis reports come out like. It's largely prescriptive in nature, and I have my own comments on that I can go into later. But the idea is you take your two critical uncertainties and you form out these 4 scenarios that fit within their own unique and mutually exclusive regions. My data did not support that. I found that there was more of a continuum of understanding for these scenarios that lies solely along the internal workings of the government, the government intervention side, and left me with 2 scenarios, scenario 1 and scenario 2, which I'll go into here. There's a lot of bullet points, so don't worry too much about reading those. Scenario 1 refers to the positive capacity for growth along existing institutions in the Canadian Arctic, usually through gentle nudging from the federal government and fair play with all international parties. Scenario 2 moved anywhere from the neglect and mismanagement of the Arctic and its eventual decay into possibly even a security crisis, which could allow for foreign powers to become more active in the region and possibly even cede territory. So the implications of discussion were fairly wide-reaching. Primarily the fact that the groups interviewed agreed on the fact that there is little understanding of what the political organs are going to be doing in the future. Even the government members were uncertain about what Canada had to do in order to make certain things happen. They knew what the outcomes should look like, but whether or not they would occur was up in the air. However, it was agreed on that Canada currently possesses the institutions and developmental capacity to make the positive change occur, especially the positive relationships and meaningful partnerships between industry, government, and most importantly, Indigenous peoples in the North. The development investments have to be large leaps and bounds, meaningful action that will actually take place over the next 50 to 75 years. And it was unlikely, or at least the confidence levels were low by all participants, that this would occur without the necessary political will, which could be found in the case of a large event or crisis. But that, again, is an uncertainty in itself. So recommendations were hard to come by because my review was primarily scoping. I did a lot of exploratory work, and it has changed quite a bit over since the inception of the project. But increasing the engagement between decision-making bodies and the active bodies, as in the operators of the vessels and the Indigenous peoples that live and work on the land and waters up there, is of utmost importance. And that includes things like CMAX, the Canadian Marine Advisory Consortium, that only occurs once a year, previously twice a year, in regards to the Canadian Arctic. The Arctic needs to be identified more rapidly as a critical zone that requires action, and further research, of course, is required in terms of a larger scope of not only a larger research population, but also one that reaches out to Indigenous peoples, given the time and place. I found out the hard way that you can't really do that over the summer because Indigenous peoples are out on the ice and the people operating the vessels are generally working. So that was a key takeaway for myself. And this is a wonderful quote that I got off one of my participants, who I'd like to thank very, very deeply for all of their help with this. The excitement that is portrayed here in the ability to do it right the first time, because we don't have to cut it down this time. So here are my references for the brief number of figures that I had in here. I apologize for the lack of those. I attribute that entirely to working for engineers all summer. And I'd like to say thank you to my supervisor, Professor Flores Borland, my supporting supervisor, Professor Ron Plo, the Department of Engineering here, Industrial Engineering here at Dalhousie, for funding my research, the Marine Affairs program for making it happen, all of you for being here in the room, and everyone home online. And that's everything. Here's questions.
Thank you, Riley. We'll go straight over here.
Hi, great job.
I was just curious about in your method section, you showed the survey participants, and in a list. I was wondering what happened to ID numbers 2 and 8. Were those like interviews you couldn't use or data you had to take out?
So originally I was slated to perform 12 interviews and I had those interviews lined up with PIN numbers assigned. They didn't happen because life happened first, and that's just how it goes. I should say that not all of these interviews actually turned out the way that they should have been. Some ran very long, some were quite short, and others actually were only able to come in as written responses because of the requirements that some of these industry workers have to their jobs that come before helping out a master's student researcher. So, thank you.
Hi, Early. Thank you. I'm curious, given like the conversations and the interviews you had, and how you talked about like a potential security crisis, and the willingness of Northern Canadians to participate. How often, if you can speak to this in your interviews, did like the way that the Canadian government has dealt with Arctic sovereignty in the past come up? Like, because it's been like, I don't know, things like forced migration and relocation, like those were pretty atrocious. So how did those things come up and sort of influence your conversations and people's opinions on getting things right this time around?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a lot is the short answer. The idea of being able to establish sovereignty through a capacity to operate and do so sustainably in the North was something identified as a leadership role for Canada in the future. One that we've taken on before in 1970 with the Unilateral Protection Acts for our sensitive ice-covered environments, but also in 1985 when we updated that to, and also helped out in the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea. I will say that from the interview data that I collected, it was assumed by industry members that Northern Canadians were hoping to participate and willing to do so, and a lot of times have the resources to do so, but whether or not they're actually effectively engaged by the federal government and allowed to do the things that they want to do to help out was called into question, was a definite uncertainty. The idea of doing it right the first time refers mostly to industrial development, so the increased accessibility for sea lift, the help to develop and grow the northern population, and also to allow Indigenous Canadians and Northern Canadians in general to establish their own sovereignty their own way, was a theme that came up, I'd say, in likely every single one of my interviews. I can get back to you with an exact number, but I don't think there was much time in between. Thank you, Brian.
It's cute.
Thanks so much, Riley. One of the quotes you showed used the word courage. And I'm just curious about kind of how courage came up in the interviews and what it might mean, do you think, for Canada to lead with courage in this upcoming management problem?
Mm-hmm. Courage, I think, in this case was used as a synonym of political will, public ability, public willingness to actually contribute to a lot of the things that are going on. But of course, you see time and time again, and this is myself speaking here, to the fact that industry and the ability to make money to capitalize on investment, it can trump a desire to do so sustainably. When faced with the challenges in the Canadian Arctic, development cannot occur yet, but when it does begin, it will happen very, very, very fast. So being able to attribute and contribute those resources to the region effectively and do so now before it seems pressing, and when there's no guarantee that it could pay off correctly, is what is going to absolutely take every single cell of the political organ that is in charge of this. Of course, thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm curious, so you come from a securities background, if you will, perhaps on a part-time basis. So far, that's to change. And I'm curious how you see, drawing from that outside experience, the relationship between what you described as the potential for very rapid development in the Arctic when and if that time should come, and the ability of Canada to provide the security for both the people who live there, as well as the people who wish to invest or build economic wealth there.
So as an academic, I can answer this question. Security forces are to be used exclusively as a last resort. That is, I know that is Government of Canada's official position, but it's also as a political science undergrad, I do share that thought. The idea that we could lean heavily on a naval, Air Force, Army presence in the area to secure or allow for future investment would be short-sighted, to say the least. Canada would be much better off to demonstrate its ability to operate in the north and its sovereignty in the region by allowing for sustainable development, for safe and productive and proactive action that could grow the region and show that we are capable of using it and capable of engaging the peoples that live there, rather than just saying that we have the biggest stick. If that answers your question, Doctor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See several more questions, but we are out of time and I don't want to keep anyone from their lunch.
If you have extra questions, please feel free to email me or see me afterwards. So thank you very much.
Max?
Do you want the your one?
Okay.
All right, thanks, everybody. I know, like, as was mentioned, lunch is on the way, but not here. So just a few housekeeping things, and I won't keep you too long. First of all, I would just like to say a massive congratulations to you guys. We're so proud of you to see how far you've come, your writing skills, your presentation skills. I think suffice to say you guys all crushed it. So thank you. Congratulations. And you're also, Kaylee and I, you are our first cohort. So you guys will always hold a very special place in our hearts.
Go Bears.
Sorry, Kaylee. I'll try not to make you cry. On that note, a huge shout out to Kaylee for pulling this all together and making it all happen. Thank you so much. So like I said, a master's in 16 months is not easy. Do you agree? Yes. But congratulations again, you did it. Last fall, the Marine Affairs program had a retreat during our student field trip, our proof of concept field trip to the Huntsman Marine Science Center. While you guys were at the pub, we were working. There we crafted a new vision and mission statement, and I'd like to read you our shiny new vision. Dalhousie's Marine Affairs program fosters a transdisciplinary and innovative learning environment for future leaders, equipping them with the knowledge and experience needed to create real-world solutions for impactful marine and coastal management. We envision our graduates as catalysts for positive change. And I wanted to read that specifically for the last sentence. We envision you as catalysts for positive change in the future. So to the class of 23-24, we look forward to watching you make change in the world and have no doubt that you will. So take a few moments to reflect on your journey and be proud of what you guys have all accomplished, because we are proud of you. So to everyone, it is a slow trickle to graduation. It's a bit of a weird thing with a 16-month program. You technically have finished most of your requirements for your degree. You've done the presentation. Your papers will be marked by December 20th, and then you will have a final mark that you can look up fairly soon. And then you have until February to get your project onto DalSpace through Kaylee. She'll be handing you at some point soon. And then we will be inviting you back in May for graduation, and we'll be hosting a celebration for you, friends, and family. So we will see you again soon. But for now, to everybody in the audience, online and in person, thank you so much for your support and participation here at Making Waves. We will now move to the upstairs of the Oxford Tap Room at Quinpool in Oxford. Yes. There are free drink tickets coming. So please, and for those those of you that were there last year, we had this amazing lunch catered from Curry Village. The good news and bad news, the bad news is that Curry Village is now closed, but the good news is that Rasa Indian food has taken the place. So we'll see you at Oxford Tap Room. Thank you guys so much. Thanks everybody online for joining.